She was barefoot, bleeding, and running for her life, and she had exactly 4 seconds to decide whether to trust a complete stranger. Vivienne Carrington controlled a billion-dollar empire. She had lawyers, bodyguards, drivers, and a penthouse above the Chicago skyline. All of that meant absolutely nothing. All she had was a torn evening gown, a stolen flash drive, and 3 armed men closing the distance behind her in an underground parking garage. She ran straight toward the one light she could see a grease-stained man under a pickup truck and prayed he wasn't about to get them both killed. If you're new here, subscribe right now and hit that bell, because this channel is where we tell the stories that keep you up at night. Drop your city and country in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. And if you stay until the very end tonight, you'll understand why this particular story broke me a little. Hit the like button, get comfortable, and let's go. The parking garage beneath the Harrington Grand Hotel occupied 4 underground levels, and on any normal Thursday night, the lowest level smelled like oil, exhaust, and the particular kind of cold that soaks through concrete and never really leaves. Graham Rourke had been working on the same truck for going on 3 hours. It wasn't his truck. It belonged to a hotel regular named Dennis Patowski, a retired postal worker who drove a 2009 Ford F-150 that had no business still running, and yet somehow kept running anyway, which Graham had decided was either a miracle of American engineering or a personal insult to every principle of mechanical logic he had ever learned. Rear differential was shot. The brake lines were borderline criminal, and somebody, Dennis, presumably had at some point attempted to replace the serpentine belt using what appeared to be electrical tape and optimism. Yet, Graham had been lying on a rolling board under the chassis, penlight between his teeth, when he first heard the footsteps. He noticed them not because they were loud, but because they were wrong. There's a rhythm to how people walk through a parking garage when they know where they're going. Purposeful, even. The soft echo of someone heading toward a specific car. Graham had been listening to that rhythm all evening. Hotel guests, a valet, a couple arguing quietly near the elevator bank about something that wasn't really about whatever they said it was about. These footsteps were different. These footsteps were running. Heels on concrete, uneven, increasing density, and then a sound that made him pull the penlight from his teeth and go very still. A woman, breathing the way people breathe when they're past fear, and into something worse. Yes, he rolled out from under the truck. She came around the corner of the support pillar at full speed and nearly ran straight into the front bumper. She caught herself on the hood, both hands slapping metal, and spun to look behind her, and that was when Graham saw her face for the first time. She was maybe 30, dark hair, half collapsed from whatever arrangement it had been in at the start of the evening. An evening gown black, expensive with a tear running from the hip down to the knee that hadn't come from dancing. Shoes. Her feet were bare on the concrete, and he could see a cut across the arch of her left foot that was leaving small, dark prints behind her.
Yeah.
For exactly a second, she looked at him with the expression of someone who has run out of options and knows it. Then she looked back over her shoulder. "How many?" Graham said. She snapped her head back toward him. She hadn't expected that question. "The people behind you." He kept his voice flat, quiet, the way you talk when you don't want sound to carry. "How many?" She stared at him. He could see her recalibrating. She'd expected panic from him, or maybe paralysis, the way most people freeze when violence walks into their evening unannounced. "3," she said. "Maybe 4. I didn't stop to count." She opened her mouth, closed it. "Yes. I think yes." The one in the suit had something under his jacket. The other 2, she stopped herself. "Who are you?" "I work here." He set the penlight down on the truck's bumper, slow and deliberate. "Come around to this side of the vehicle." "I don't even know your name." He said it quietly, not unkindly. "We can do introductions, or we can move." "Both." "Which one?" She moved. She came around the passenger side of the truck and pressed herself against the concrete pillar behind it, and Graham stepped out toward the center of the lane and listened. He counted 3 sets of footsteps now. 2 coming fast along the outer ring, 1 slower. The slower one was hanging back, and that one was the one that mattered, because hanging back meant covering, and covering meant the slow one knew what he was doing. 3 men, okay. Graham had a penlight, a set of socket wrenches, and approximately 40 years of accumulated experience in understanding the difference between men who were going to shoot first and men who were going to look first. He picked up a socket wrench from the toolbox and held it loosely at his side. The first two came around the corner together. Big men, late 30s, wearing the kind of dark, tactical clothing that people wear when they want to look like professionals. The one on the left was scanning. The one on the right had already spotted the truck and was moving toward it. The third one walked in. He was different. Older. 50, maybe. Silver at his temples, moving with the unhurried confidence of someone who has never in his life had to rush because things always arranged themselves according to his preferences. He wore a suit the way certain men wear suits as a statement rather than a garment. His eyes swept the garage with the systematic efficiency of a man reading a room, not reacting to it. Those eyes landed on Graham, and something happened in the man's face that Graham had not expected. Recognition. Not casual recognition. Not "I think I've seen you somewhere." This was the hard, specific recognition of a man who has looked at a photograph a number of times in a professional context. The man in the suit put his hand up, flat and open, to his two companions. They stopped. Nobody spoke for a moment. "Mr. Rourke," the man in the suit said finally. Graham said nothing. "This doesn't concern you." The man said it pleasantly, which was its own kind of threat. "We're simply here to speak with a colleague." "She didn't look like she wanted to talk," Graham said. "She doesn't always know what's good for her." Still pleasant. "Step aside, and this evening continues without incident. I give you my word." Graham looked at him steadily. "Your word's not worth much to me." The man in the suit studied him for a long moment. Graham could see the calculation happening, the weighing of options, the arithmetic of risk. The two companions had gone still in the way that trained mo still when they're waiting for a signal. The man in the suit smiled. It didn't reach his eyes. "Third time," he said. He turned and walked back the way he'd come. His two men followed. Their footsteps faded, and then the garage was quiet again, except for the distant sound of the ventilation system and a car alarm going off somewhere on an upper level. Graham waited a full 45 seconds before he turned toward the pillar where the woman was pressed. "They're gone," he said. She came out from behind the pillar slowly, like she didn't quite believe it yet. Her arms were wrapped around herself against the cold, and she was looking at the empty mouth of the garage entrance, the way you look at a place where something dangerous was standing 30 seconds ago. "Come back," she said. It wasn't a question. "Probably." She looked at him. "Who are you?" "Graham Rourke. I repair vehicles for the hotel." He paused. "Who are you?" She hesitated, the half-second hesitation of a person who is trying to decide how much of the truth is safe. And then Vivienne Carrington. He recognized the name. Everybody in Chicago recognized the name. Carrington Capital. $12 billion in assets under management. 3 acquisitions in the last 4 years that had made the front page of the Tribune, and a CEO profile in Forbes that his daughter had mentioned because she had to write a paper on women in business for her junior year economics class. Kept his face neutral. "Your clutch," he said. She looked down at the small evening bag still somehow looped over her wrist. "What about it?" "Hand it to me." She frowned. "Why would I?" "Miss Carrington." Same quiet, flat tone he'd used before. "Either there's a tracking device on you somewhere, or those men found this garage very efficiently on a Thursday night. You came in from the east stairwell. That's not the main entrance. So either they followed you directly here, which means they were already very close when you ran, or something on you told them where you were going." Very still. Then she held out the clutch. He took it and opened it carefully on the truck's hood. Credit card, hotel key card. Phone, he set that aside. Lipstick, a folded receipt, and at the very bottom, tucked into the interior lining with enough care to be nearly invisible, a small black disc the size of a shirt button. He held it up between 2 fingers. Her expression did something complicated. "I didn't put that there," she said. "I know. How do you know?" "Because if you'd put it there yourself, you wouldn't have run." He set it back down on the hood. "When did you last have this bag in someone else's hands?" She thought. He could see her working through the evening backward, reconstructing the sequence, and he could also see the moment she landed on something. "The coat check," she said quietly. I left it for maybe 10 minutes at the coat check when I went to take a call. I had to use the house phone, and I didn't want to carry everything. She paused. It was just the bag. I didn't think... You couldn't have known. He picked up the track and walked toward the far corner of the garage, toward a catering van that was parked near the service entrance. He slid open the van's side door unlocked. Hotel staff didn't always lock them, and placed the tracker carefully in the wheel well, where it would ride out the night undisturbed. When he came back, she was looking at him differently than she had before. "You've done this before," she said. It wasn't quite a question. "Different context," he said. "Come on, there's a service break room 2 levels up. It'll be warm, and the cameras on that floor have been out for 3 weeks, because the hotel's fighting with the contractor over who's responsible for fixing them." She followed him without arguing, which told him something about how badly rattled she was. In Graham's experience, people who were used to being in control argued about everything, even when arguing made no sense. The fact that she was following without comment meant she understood at some level that she was outside the edges of her experience in a way that control couldn't solve. The service break room was a narrow space with 2 folding tables, a commercial coffee maker that looked like it had been installed during the Reagan administration, and a row of metal lockers along one wall. Fluorescent lights, linoleum floor, 3 plastic chairs. Vivienne Carrington sat in one of those plastic chairs in her torn evening gown and her bare feet, and she looked, for just a moment, like someone much younger than whatever Forbes had written about her. Graham poured 2 cups of coffee from the machine. The coffee was terrible, he knew from experience, but it was hot, and set one in front of her. She wrapped her hands around it. "Thank you," she said, and she meant it in a way that had nothing to do with the coffee. He sat across from her. "What did you find?" She looked up. "The men in the garage," he said. "People don't send 3 armed men after a CEO in a hotel parking garage because of a contract dispute." "What did you find?" She was quiet for a long moment. The fluorescent light hummed overhead. Somewhere far above them, in the hotel proper, a Thursday night continued, as though nothing had happened, as though the world was the ordinary, manageable thing most people needed it to be. $612 million, she said. Graham waited. Federal contracts. Defense procurement. Primarily equipment, logistics support, some infrastructure. She turned the coffee cup slowly between her palms. Carrington Capital has subsidiaries that hold positions in 17 federal contractors. It's not unusual. Everybody does it. She paused. What's unusual is when the contracts are real and the work isn't. Ghost billing, he said. She nodded. On a scale I didn't think was possible. It's not one company. It's a network, multiple contractors, multiple contract categories, all of them with legitimate paperwork, legitimate oversight sign-offs, legitimate audits. She stopped. Except the audits weren't legitimate. I had my own forensic team go in 6 weeks ago when I noticed anomalies in the subsidiary reports. And 2 weeks later, my lead auditor, Elliot Marlowe, told me he'd found documentation connecting the fraud to people higher up than the contractors themselves. She set the coffee cup down. 4 days after that, Elliot Marlowe drove his car off the I-90 overpass near Roselle. The fluorescent light hummed. They said it was ice on the road, she said. Her voice was steady, but it was the kind of steady that costs something. It wasn't ice. There was no ice anywhere else on that stretch that night. His car went straight through the barrier, like the wheel wasn't being turned. Graham was quiet. The other one was Marcus Webb, she continued. He worked in my legal department. He'd been helping Marlowe with document authentication. 3 weeks ago, he had a heart attack in his apartment. He was 34 years old. 34-year-olds have heart attacks, Graham said. Dismissing it, just accounting for it. They do. But 34-year-olds who have sent you an encrypted message at 2 in the morning saying, I think we're in serious trouble and I don't know who to trust don't usually have heart attacks the next morning. She looked at him directly. I don't know who to trust either. That's not a small problem when you run a company with 12,000 employees and 40 board members, and somebody inside that structure is connected to the people who just chased me barefoot through a parking garage. Graham drank his coffee. It was, as anticipated, extremely bad coffee. The man in the suit, he said. The one who recognized me. Who he is? She shook her head. I've never seen him before tonight. Was at a fundraiser Upstairs. I shouldn't have even been in the garage, but I'd gone down to retrieve something from my driver's car, and I saw them in the stairwell before they saw me. I ran." She paused. "You said they found you too easily." "You were right. I was only in that garage for maybe 4 minutes before." She stopped. "You said different context. About having done this before." He set his cup down. "I worked for the government," he said. "For a while." She waited for him to say more. He didn't. She was smart enough not to push. He noticed that. "The man in the suit recognized your name," she said instead. "You saw his face." "Yes. That means you're already in this. Whatever this is." She looked at him steadily across the folding table. This woman who controlled a $12 billion empire and was sitting in a service break room with bad coffee and a cut on her foot. "It also means you're not just a mechanic." "I am just a mechanic," Graham said. "That's not a cover story. That's just my life." "But it wasn't always." He said, "It wasn't always." She seemed to accept that the way she'd accepted the plastic chair and the terrible coffee as the reality of the situation, not the reality she'd expected or wanted, but the one she had. "I have documentation," she said. "Marlowe's documentation. He gave me copies before he died, before they killed him. I have them in a safety deposit box at a branch in Wicker Park. Who to take them to?" She paused. "I still don't. If the fraud connects to federal oversight officials the way Marlowe believed it does, I can't go to the FBI without knowing which people there are already compromised." "You can't go home either," Graham said. "If they planted a tracker tonight, your home has been assessed. Your office too. I know. You have people who depend on you?" She blinked. It wasn't the question she'd expected. Yes. 12,000 employees. I meant personally." She was quiet for a moment. "Not the way you mean. My parents are both gone. I was married for 3 years, but that ended a long time ago." She said it without self-pity, the way you state facts about geography. "Children." Graham nodded, then he stood up. "I have a daughter," he said. "She's 17. She's staying with my neighbor tonight, which is good, because she doesn't need to be in the middle of whatever this is." He picked up the cups and set them in the small utility sink. "I have a house in Bridgeport. Nothing fancy, but it's not connected to you. And it's not somewhere anyone would look for you." She stared at him. "You're offering me shelter," she said, like she was translating from a language she didn't quite speak. "I'm offering you somewhere to think without someone chasing you," he said. "There's a difference. Shelter implies I'm fixing something. I'm not in the business of fixing things." He paused. "This kind of thing. But the man in that garage knew my name," he said it simply, "which means this is already my business, whether I want it to be or not." She looked at him for a long moment, this woman, who had built a $12 billion company on the ability to read people, to understand the difference between what someone was offering and what they actually meant. "You could have let them take me," she said. "I could have," he agreed. "Why didn't you?" He considered the question honestly, the way he'd learned to consider things after enough years of having to explain his choices to a teenage girl who had no patience for anything that wasn't genuinely true. "You were barefoot," he said finally. "On a concrete floor in February." He picked up his toolbox. "Deserves that." She almost smiled. It was brief, and it had some complicated thing behind it, relief, maybe. Or the particular kind of gratitude that comes when something human shows up exactly when you've stopped expecting it. "I'm Vivienne," she said, like they were meeting for the first time, in a normal context, in a normal world, he said. "Forbes did a piece on you. My daughter had to read it for school. What did your daughter think of it?" "She thought you looked like someone who worked too hard." He moved toward the door. She wasn't wrong. "Come on." They took his truck. The one he'd been repairing wasn't his, so he used the older Chevy he'd driven in, a battered thing with a cracked dashboard and a heater that needed 10 minutes before it convinced itself to produce warmth. He drove Vivienne out of the hotel's service exit, not the main garage, circling twice through the River North streets to confirm there was no one behind them before he pointed the truck south toward Bridgeport. She sat in the passenger seat with her arms folded against the cold and said nothing for the first several miles. He appreciated that. Most people filled silence the way they filled discomfort, reflexively, without thinking about whether the words were useful. Vivienne Carrington apparently thought about it. "The documentation," she said, as they crossed into the south side. Marlowe was specific about who he believed was above the contractors. He mentioned a name. Graham kept his eyes on the road. A man named Reddick. Malcolm Reddick. He said Reddick was the federal oversight coordinator for 3 of the contract networks. She paused. Does that name mean anything to you? The heater had finally decided to work. Warm air moved through the cab, and outside the windows, Chicago slid past in its nighttime version, the orange glow of streets on brick, the dark stretches between. The city that was always slightly awake no matter what the hour said. Graham drove another full block before he answered. He said his voice was level. His hands on the wheel were level. But something had shifted behind his eyes. Vivienne, who was very good at reading people, saw it immediately. She said, I knew to him. He turned south on Halstead. A long time ago in a different context. The same context, she said quietly. The government context. He didn't confirm it. He didn't deny it. He just drove, and the city moved past, and Vivienne Carrington sat with the weight of what she didn't know yet. The weight of a name she'd dropped into the cab of a beat-up truck and watched land on a man like a stone dropped into still water. The ripples were already spreading. She didn't know yet that what she'd found wasn't just corporate fraud. She didn't know yet that the network she'd stumbled into had a name and a history and a reach that extended back 9 years into a chapter of Graham Rourke's life that he had spent a very long time convincing himself was finished. She didn't know yet, but she would. Yes, ye noons. Graham's house was a 2-story row house on a side street that still had its original 1920s brick facing, because Bridgeport was the kind of neighborhood that kept things if they still worked and fixed them if they didn't, which had always suited Graham's general philosophy of life. Inside, functional, undecorated in any self-conscious way. A couch, a television that was never on when he was alone. A kitchen table with 4 chairs, one of which had a calculus textbook on it, and a half-finished problem set that his daughter had left and would absolutely be back for. A framed photograph on the mantel. A woman and a girl. The woman was laughing, caught in the middle of something, such her hair across her face, her hand reaching to push it away. The girl was maybe 7 or 8 in the photo, and she had her mother's eyes. Vivienne noticed the photograph, but didn't say anything about it. Graham found her a pair of his daughter's sweatpants and a flannel shirt, both of which were large enough to fit because Katie, to her own frequent complaint, had inherited his build rather than her mother's. He found a first aid kit and cleaned the cut on Vivienne's foot while she sat on the edge of the couch and examined the wound with the pragmatic detachment of someone who had learned, sometime during the last few hours, not to have feelings about small things. It's not deep, he said. You won't need stitches. Doesn't even hurt anymore. She paused. I think that's probably adrenaline. Probably. He pressed a bandage over it and sat back. And she looked down at the flannel shirt and the sweatpants and the bandage, and she laughed a short, startled sound, like she hadn't expected to. I had a $200,000 evening planned tonight, she said. Museum gala. I was the keynote speaker. She shook her head. I wrote 12 minutes of remarks about the intersection of private capital and cultural preservation. How were they? Honestly? She thought about it. Polished but forgettable. I've given better speeches. She looked at him. What I was going to do after the gala. Go back to my penthouse and go over Marlowe's documents again. I'd been doing it every night for a week, trying to find something I'd missed. Something that would tell me exactly how high this went before I decided who to take it to. She was quiet for a moment. Turns out someone else decided the timeline for me. Graham stood and walked to the kitchen. He came back with 2 glasses of water, not coffee this time. Just water, and set one on the end table next to her. Marlowe's documents, he said. You'd said he believed Reddick was the oversight coordinator. Did he have documentation of that, or was it a conclusion? He had intercepted communications, he never explained to me how he got them, and financial records showing that approval signatures on 3 of the largest fraudulent contracts matched authorization codes. Assigned to Reddick's office. She picked up the water. But there was something else. In his final message to me the night before he died, he said he'd found evidence suggesting the network had been active for much longer than the contracts I'd discovered. He said he thought it went back at least 9 or 10 years. The house was quiet. Graham sat in the armchair across from her. The photograph on the mantel was at the edge of his field of vision. The woman with her hair across her face, the girl with her mother's eyes. He thought about a conversation he'd had in a different city, in a different decade, in a life that still had different things in it. He thought about a briefing room, and a stack of documents, and a federal supervisor sitting across from him saying, "You've done good work, Rourke. We'll take it from here." He thought about what "we'll take it from here" apparently meant when the person saying it was Malcolm Reddick. Vivienne said. He looked at her. "What is this?" she asked. "The corporate fraud. You understood what I was telling you too quickly for it to be unfamiliar. Reddick's name, and it means something to you that you haven't told me. What is this?" He was quiet long enough that she didn't rush to fill it. "When I was in the service," he said finally, choosing words with the care of someone who has had a long time to think about how much truth is useful and how much is just weight, "there was an investigation. A classified task force. We were looking at a corruption network, federal contracts, government officials, private sector intermediaries." He paused. "The network had a name. We called it Harrow." Vivienne was very still. "I gathered evidence for 2 years," Graham continued. "At the end of it, I handed everything to my federal supervisor because I was leaving. My wife had died 8 months earlier. My daughter was 11 years old, and she was living with my sister-in-law because I'd been deployed and embedded and away for most of the previous 3 years, and she was getting quieter every time I came home." He said this evenly, not asking for anything from it. "I couldn't keep doing what I was doing, so I gave the case to Reddick and I came home. And Harrow was never prosecuted," Vivienne said softly. "Never even charged. I checked when I could for the first year or so. The task force was disbanded. The case files were closed. Everything I'd spent 2 years building gone." He looked at his hands briefly, then back at her. "I told myself it was above my pay grade, that there were things I didn't know about why it ended, that the system had handled it in a way I didn't have visibility into. But I knew Reddick was the one who took the evidence." He said it quietly. "I've had a long time to think about what that means." Vivienne sat with that for a moment. "So Harrow didn't end," she said. "It just kept going. And $612 million later," Graham said, "you tripped over it in your own subsidiary reports." She looked at the photograph on the mantel. The woman laughing. The girl with her mother's eyes. "Your daughter," she said. "Katie," he said. "She's why you left. She's why I left, and she's why I stayed." He leaned forward, forearms on his knees, and he looked at Vivienne with the direct, uncomplicated attention of someone who has had exactly enough of pretending a thing isn't what it is. "Whatever this is, and I think we both know now what this is, it came back to find me. Maybe because of you. Maybe it was already coming. I don't know. But I need you to understand something before we go any further." "What?" "I have a 17-year-old daughter who is staying at my neighbor's house tonight. She doesn't know any of this exists, and that keeping her out of it is not negotiable. Whatever we do, however we do it, Katie stays out." "Of course," Vivienne said. No hesitation. "I mean it," he said. "Of course, as a polite agreement. I mean, I will end this, whatever we're building here, the moment she becomes a variable in it." Vivienne met his eyes. "I understand," she said. And she said it the way she'd said the earlier things, with the directness of someone who didn't have the energy left for anything that wasn't true. "I don't have a Katie, but I understand what you're telling me." He nodded. Outside, Chicago continued its night. Somewhere above them, in a penthouse neither of them was going to, a 12-minute speech about private capital and cultural preservation sat on a podium, undelivered. In a parking garage on the north side, a catering van with a GPS tracker in its wheel sat quietly beneath the city. And in a house in Bridgeport, a former Navy SEAL and a billionaire CEO sat across from each other with 2 glasses of water and a case that was 9 years older than either of them had known 20 minutes ago. "Tomorrow morning," Graham said, "we get Marlowe's documents." Vivienne nodded. And then, he said, "we figure out exactly how far down this goes." She looked at him, this man who fixed trucks for a living and moved through parking garages like someone who had once been paid to walk through much more dangerous rooms than that. "If it goes to the top?" she asked. He picked up his glass. "Then it goes to the top," he said. "It had to stop somewhere, eventually." Neither of them slept much that night. Vivienne sat at Graham's kitchen table with a legal pad he'd found in a drawer, writing down everything she could remember from Marlowe's documents. Every name, Every figure, every reference she hadn't quite understood at the time, but understood better now. Made a second, and then a third cup of coffee from a better machine than the one in the hotel break room, though not dramatically so, and he sat across from her hair and asked questions in that quiet, unhurried way of his, and she answered them. By the time the sky outside the kitchen window had shifted from black to the particular gray that precedes Chicago's reluctant dawns, they had 4 pages of notes, 2 lists of names, the first shape of something that looked, tentatively, like the outline of a plan. It wasn't much, but it was more than they'd had barefoot in a parking garage, which Graham pointed out, and which made Vivienne laugh again, the same brief, startled sound as before, like she kept being surprised by the fact that she was still capable of it. Outside, the city was beginning its Friday. Buses and trucks and early commuters. The ordinary, necessary machinery of a place that never quite knows what's happening beneath it. Graham poured the last of the coffee, divided it between 2 mugs, and pushed one across the table without comment. She took it. Neither of them said what they were both thinking, that the day ahead was going to be hard, and that hard was probably underselling it, and that the man whose name sat at the top of Vivienne's handwritten list had 9 years and considerable resources to protect what he'd built. But Graham Rourke had spent 9 years in a repair shop in Bridgeport, and the thing about fixing broken things was that it required a very specific kind of patience, the willingness to look at something everyone else had given up on, and believe, because you were optimistic, but because you understood the mechanics, that it could still be made to run. He was patient, he understood the mechanics, and for the first time in 9 years, he had a reason to go back in. The coffee was gone by 7:30. And with it went the last comfortable illusion that this was a problem that could be solved by sitting at a kitchen table with a legal pad. Graham had been awake for most of the night. He hadn't tried particularly hard to sleep. Sleep was a resource, and you managed resources according to the situation, and the situation was not one that rewarded switching off. He dozed for maybe 90 minutes in the armchair in the living room, his jacket still on, his phone on the cushion next to him with the volume up. Old habit. The kind that doesn't unlearn itself just because the context changes. Vivienne had fallen asleep around 4, still at the kitchen table, her head on her forearm, one hand still loosely holding a pen. He draped a blanket over her shoulders and left her there. It seemed wrong to move her. She'd looked in that possession like someone who had finally stopped holding themselves together by sheer will and had just let go, peacefully. More like a machine that had finally run out of whatever was keeping it running. He'd stood there for a moment longer than was necessary, looking at the 4 pages of notes, in her handwriting, neat, controlled, the handwriting of someone trained to produce order under pressure, and thought about Elliot Marlowe, who had driven off an overpass on a clear winter night. He thought about Marcus Webb, 34 years old, who had sent a frightened message at 2 a.m. and been dead before he could say more. Then he went and sat in the armchair and watched the door until the sky went gray. By the time Vivienne woke, Graham had already called his neighbor, Helen, who was 63 years old, and had been looking out for Katie in various practical capacities since Graham had moved to Bridgeport 5 years ago. Helen asked no unnecessary questions, which was one of the reasons Graham had always trusted her. Yet, he told her Katie should stay through the weekend if possible, that there was a complication with a job that needed his full attention. Helen said she'd tell Katie he'd called. Graham said to tell her he'd be in touch by Saturday. Helen said fine and hung up. Katie predictably texted him 4 minutes later. What kind of complication? He texted back. Nothing serious. Just messy. You good? Yes, but Mrs. Kowalski made me eat eggs this morning, and you know I don't eat eggs. Eat the eggs? I hate the eggs, I know. Eat them anyway. There was a pause then. Are you okay? He looked at that for a moment. Yeah, talk soon. She sent back a single thumbs up, which from Katie meant she wasn't convinced, but had decided not to push it, which was both reassuring and a little heartbreaking in the particular way that teenagers who have learned not to push it tend to be. He set the phone down when Vivienne came in from the kitchen, the blanket still around her shoulders, her hair a wreck, holding the empty coffee mug like she was hoping it would refill itself through force of will. There's a spare toothbrush in the cabinet under the sink, he said. Second shelf. I found it. Thank you. She sat down across from him. What time is it? 7:40. You didn't sleep. I slept some. She looked at him with the steady, evaluating look that he was beginning to understand was just her default mode, not skepticism exactly. More like she was running everything through a filter that didn't have an off switch. How long before we can move? The bank branch in Wicker Park opens at 9, he said. We've got time. But there are things we need to address before we walk in there, such as surveillance. The branch has cameras, which is unavoidable, but your face is going to be more recognizable than mine. We need to think about how we handle that. He leaned forward. Also, how many people know about the safety deposit box? She thought about it. Marlowe set it up. He had a key, and I have a key. He's dead. She paused. If they went through his effects after he died, and they would have, if they were thorough, they might know a box exists. They might not know which branch, but they could find out. Yes, so we assume they're looking, he said, which means we don't go in the front door together and we don't linger. He stood up. I have some things in the garage. Give me 20 minutes. The things in the garage were, specifically, 2 baseball caps, a pair of reading glasses with plain lenses that he'd picked up years ago for a reason he'd since forgotten, and a zip-up coverall in dark navy that he kept for messy jobs. He'd intervened. He also had a phone repaid, still in its packaging, bought 8 months ago at a Walgreens for a job that had ended before he needed it. He loaded the SIM and tested it while Vivienne changed in the bathroom. She came out in Katie's sweatpants and the flannel shirt, the baseball cap low on her forehead, and she looked like someone who had given a great deal of thought to the Forbes profile, and then decided to be the opposite of it. The cut on her foot was holding. She'd redressed it herself. You have a daughter who wears flannel, she observed. She goes through phases. 3 months ago, it was all black. Before that, it was vintage sports jerseys. He handed her the plain-lensed glasses. Put these on. They change the shape of your face more than you'd think. She put them on without comment. He was right, they did. They took the Chevy out of Bridgeport before 8, moving north through the city in the ordinary morning traffic, which was its own kind of cover. Chicago on a Friday morning was a specific kind of controlled chaos, the river of commuter vehicles. The delivery trucks double-parked in defiance of every traffic ordinance ever written. The buses moving with the slow authority of something that knows nothing is going to move it. Graham drove at exactly the pace of traffic, neither fast nor slow, a man with nowhere particular to be. Vivienne sat in the passenger seat with the legal pad on her knee, reviewing her notes. She'd been quiet since they got in the car, but it was a working quiet he could see, her eyes moving, slightly pressed together. Reddick's office, she said without looking up. Marlowe said the authorization codes matched Reddick's office, not necessarily Reddick himself. Could someone else in his office have been the point of access? Possible, Graham said. But Reddick ran a tight unit. Nothing moved through his oversight office without his direct sign-off. Because I worked with him briefly before I handed off the Harrow case. He was meticulous about control, kept authority concentrated. He paused. That's actually why I trusted him with the case files. People who are meticulous about control tend to be careful with sensitive information. Turns out he was careful with it for all the wrong reasons, she said. She made a note. The board chairman Sterling Vane. Marlowe mentioned him too, but only by implication. A reference to executive-level protection within Carrington Capital itself. He didn't name Vane outright. But you think it's him. I think Vane has been on my board for 11 years and has managed to be present at every major acquisition decision the company has made in that time, and has also been present in various advisory capacities at 2 of the 3 federal contract companies that appear in Marlowe's fraud documentation. She set the pen down. I could never prove it. I didn't even let myself think it too clearly. Because Sterling Vane was someone I considered a mentor, someone I trusted. She said the last word like it tasted of something she wasn't pleased about. Graham didn't say anything to that. There wasn't anything particularly useful to say. They parked 3 blocks from the Wicker Park branch in a lot that charged $8 for the morning and didn't have cameras pointed at anything useful. Graham went over it once more before they got out. You go in first, he said. Alone. I'll come in 2 minutes behind you. If anything feels wrong before you even get to the box, if you recognize anyone in the branch, if there are people who don't look like they belong there, walk out and keep walking east on Milwaukee. I'll find you. What counts as not looking like they belong? He said. You've been reading rooms your whole professional life. Trust what it tells you. She nodded. Then she got out of the truck and walked up the block with the baseball cap and the plain lens glasses and Katie's flannel shirt, and she looked like any one of 1,000 women in Wicker Park on a Friday morning, which was exactly right. Graham waited. He watched the street. Nothing moved in any way that suggested purpose. A woman walked a dog. 2 men in construction gear came out of a coffee shop. Up's driver double-parked and ran a package to a door. He gave it 2.5 minutes and went in. The branch was small and quiet at this hour. 2 tellers, a loan officer's desk in the far corner, a customer service rep on the phone, 2 other customers, an older man filling out a form at the standing desk, and a woman in her 60s depositing something at the far teller window. Vivienne was already at the back, talking to the teller who handled safe deposit access. She didn't look at Graham when he came in. He picked up a deposit form from the standing desk and stood near the older man and filled it out with meaningless numbers, watching the room. 4 minutes later, Vivienne came out of the back area with a flat envelope standard manila, letter-sized, sealed. She tucked it into the interior pocket of the jacket she'd borrowed from Graham's front closet on the way out. She made brief, complete eye contact with him as she passed. Everything's fine. He walked out 30 seconds after her. They were back in the truck in under 8 minutes total, and neither of them said a word until Graham had put 4 blocks between them and the branch. It's all there, she said. He left more than I'd seen before. There's a second envelope inside. He must have added to it after the last time I accessed the box. Open it here, Graham said. We need somewhere controlled. Your house? He thought about it. Not anymore. We used it last night, which means if anyone traced the tracker before I moved it, they might have a radius. He made a turn. A place. The place was a storage facility in Pilsen, specifically. A unit he rented under a different name, a practice he'd started years ago more out of habit than any specific expectation of needing it. Inside, a folding table, 2 camp chairs, a battery-powered lantern, and a lockbox bolted to the wall that contained documents that were his to keep and no one else's business. He'd never actually needed it for anything beyond peace of mind. He needed it now. They spread Marlowe's documents across the folding table under the lantern's steady light and spent the next 2 hours going through every page. Marlowe had been thorough in the way that people are thorough when they understand they might not be around to explain their work. He'd organized everything into 3 categories, labeled in his own handwriting, on the outside of the folders: what I found, how I found it, and what I believe it means. The first category was financial documentation spreadsheets, contract records, authorization signatures, wire transfer records that showed money moving from federal accounts into contractor accounts, and then migrating in carefully structured steps through a series of intermediary LLCs before arriving, scrubbed and legitimate-looking, in private accounts. The amounts were staggering, not because the individual transactions were large, most were surprisingly modest, in the 30 to 50,000 range, but because there were thousands of them. $612 million accumulated in careful bites over nearly a decade. The second category was more dangerous. Marlowe had obtained, and again, he didn't explain how, partial transcripts of communications between people he identified by initial only, R.V., and a third designation he'd written as the architect, which appeared in the transcripts, but which Marlowe had declined to name, noting only, identity of architect, confirmed by cross-reference to secondary source, documentation held separately for security. Graham looked at the initials for a long moment. R. Reddick v. Vane, if Vivienne's suspicion was correct. The architect remained unnamed. He was protecting the secondary source, Vivienne said. Looking at the same page. He didn't want this documentation to lead back to whoever gave him the confirmation. Which means there's someone else out there who knows, Graham said. Had to be, she said. 41 hours of intercepted communications doesn't come from guesswork. Someone gave him access. She turned the page. Someone who understood the network from the inside. The third category was Marlowe's conclusions. 5 handwritten pages. The handwriting less controlled here, written quickly, possibly under pressure. He'd laid out the timeline. Harrow, as he'd independently come to call the network, without knowing that Graham's task force had used the same name, had originated roughly 9 years prior. Yes, he'd intervened. It had survived and expanded not because it was hidden from federal oversight, but because it was embedded within it. Reddick's office hadn't been investigating the fraud. Reddick's office had been protecting it. Near the end of the third folder, Marlowe had written something that made Graham go very still. Cross-referenced operative credentials used to access contractor databases with DoD personnel records. Credentials belonged to a former SEAL-attached task force member, now private civilian. Records appear to have been reactivated without subject's knowledge. If subject is investigated, evidence will appear to show his direct involvement in contract authorization. This is the failsafe. If the investigation gets too close, they burn the ex-operator. Vivienne looked up from the same passage at the same time he did. "He's talking about you," she said quietly. "Yeah. They reactivated your credentials. They can manufacture evidence that you were part of it. It's a good play," Graham said, and he said it with the flat, functional acknowledgement of someone assessing a tactical situation rather than reacting to a personal one, because reacting to it wasn't useful. If someone starts investigating the fraud and the trail leads to me, it stops there. An ex-SEAL with financial motive, they can build a case that looks credible enough to muddy the water for years. You've been repairing trucks in Bridgeport for 5 years, and I was embedded in a classified task force investigating the exact same network 9 years ago, which on paper makes me someone with access, knowledge, and motive to protect what I built. He straightened up. It's not about conviction. It's about distraction. Keep investigators looking at me long enough for everything else to disappear. Vivienne set down the folder. So we have evidence that proves the fraud. We have evidence that Reddick is central to it. We have a strong implication of Vane. We have documentation that they've manufactured a case against you as a failsafe. She pressed her fingers to her temple. And we have an unnamed architect who apparently stands above all of it. And a dead secondary source, Graham said, who was the only person who knew Marlowe's secondary source. Marlowe didn't say the secondary source was dead, Graham said. But if they killed Marlowe and Webb, they'd have killed anyone else who was close. He paused. Unless the secondary source was careful enough not to be found. She looked at him. "You think they're still alive," she said. "I think Marlowe structured his documentation the way he did, initials only, secondary source unnamed, architecture evidence held separately because he was protecting someone who was still breathing. You protect a dead man's secrets out of loyalty. You protect a living man's identity out of necessity." He picked up the page again. Someone gave Marlowe those transcripts. That person had access to Harrow from the inside. And if they're still alive and still hidden, they're the most important witness there is, Vivienne said. "They're the only witness," Graham said. "Without them, everything Marlowe documented is strong but arguable. With them, testimony from someone who watched the network operate from the inside, it becomes something no lawyer on earth can dismantle." She was quiet for a moment, looking at the spread of documents across the table. 40 pages of Marlowe's careful work. The ledger of everything two dead men had risked everything to build. "How do we find them?" she asked. "We don't," Graham said. "We can't. We don't know enough about who they are to look." He began carefully reordering the folders. "We know who might." He looked at her steadily. "We need Damien Holt." Vivienne frowned. "That name means something to you. He was attached to the same task force 9 years ago. Different role, he was on the technical side. Signals, communications intercepts, digital forensics." Graham closed the outer envelope. "He's the one who would know if credentials were reactivated, if federal records were tampered with. If anyone can find the trail that leads to the secondary source without exposing them in the process, it's him." "Where is he now?" "Private sector. He left government work about 6 years ago. Last I knew, he was doing cybersecurity consulting, the kind that doesn't advertise." Graham picked up the prepaid phone. "I haven't talked to him in 4 years. Will he help?" Graham turned the phone over in his hand. "He has his own reasons for being unhappy about how the Harrow case ends," he said. "We both handed things over to Reddick and trusted the process. We're not the only ones who got burned." He thought for a moment. "He might help. He might also tell us to lose his number." "But you're going to call?" "Yeah." He found the number from memory, some numbers you kept in your head because writing them down was its own kind of risk, and dialed. It rang 4 times. He was preparing for voicemail. Who is this? Graham Rourke. A pause that lasted long enough to mean something. That's not a name I expected to see on an unknown number. On a Friday morning, Damien Holt said. His voice was the same as Graham remembered, flat, precise, the voice of someone who measured words and didn't give them away carelessly. I need to talk to you, Graham said. You're talking. In person. Today, if possible. Another pause. Is this about what I think it's about? Probably. Have you read the news this morning? Graham looked at Vivienne. Give me a second. He put the call on speaker and opened the prepaid phone's browser, limited, slow, but functional, and pulled up the Chicago Tribune. The headline was on the front page of the business section. He didn't need to read past it. Carrington Capital's CEO, Vivienne Carrington, under investigation for misappropriation of funds board emergency session scheduled. Vivienne went white, not the pale of surprise. The pale of someone who has just seen the thing they feared most happen in real time, faster than they'd thought possible, while they were sitting in a storage unit in Pilsen reading dead men's notes. The article was filed early that morning, clearly based on a leak rather than official statement. It said that federal investigators had received evidence suggesting Carrington personally authorized the transfer of funds from subsidiary accounts into undisclosed external accounts. It mentioned the amount, $612 million. It mentioned that her board had called an emergency session for Monday. It mentioned, in the careful language of journalism that knew exactly what it was implying, without technically implying it, yet that this investigation was unfolding with unusual speed, suggesting that the evidence against her was substantial. That's everything I was investigating, she said. Her voice was quiet and very controlled. They've taken everything I was using to prove the fraud, and they've filed it as a case against me. They moved fast, Graham said. They were already set up to move fast, she said. They had this ready. They were just waiting for... She stopped. For me to get close enough to threaten them. Into the phone, Graham said. Damien. We need to meet. Holt's voice came back flat and certain, I know. I've been watching this for 3 weeks. A beat. There's a warehouse in Chinatown I use for sensitive meetings. I'll send the address to this number. Come alone. I won't be alone. A longer pause this time. Is she with you? Holt said. Graham and Vivienne looked at each other across the folding table, across the spread of dead men's documents. Yes, Graham said. Then both of you come, Holt said. And come clean, no tail, no phone except the one you're on. Nothing that pings. If I see anything I don't like, I'm gone before you park. He paused one more time. And Rourke? They froze her accounts this morning. 20 minutes ago. I'm watching The Wire. Vivienne's jaw tightened. She said, loudly enough for the phone to catch it. Miss Carrington, Holt said, and his voice shifted only slightly, still flat, but something underneath it that wasn't quite sympathy, more like the acknowledgement of one professional to another that a bad thing had just gotten worse. We're going to need to move carefully from here. I know that too, she said. The board session is Monday, Holt said. That gives us roughly 60 hours. He paused, which is not a lot, and we're going to need every one of them. The lantern hummed up on the folding table. Outside the storage unit, Pilsen continued its Friday, the sounds of the neighborhood pressing through the metal walls. Ordinary and indifferent, and real, in the way that the world is always real, regardless of what's happening inside the room you're standing in. Graham began putting Marlowe's documents back in order, careful and methodical. Vivienne watched him and said nothing, and then she picked up the last folder, the one with Marlowe's handwritten conclusions, and held it against her chest like it was the only thing in the room that was reliably solid. They took my company, she said. Not to Graham, not to anyone in particular. Just saying it, putting it in the air where it had to be acknowledged. They tried to, Graham said. He closed the outer envelope and set it on top of the lockbox. They haven't taken it. Yet. She looked at him. You're sure about this, Holt, she said. You trust him. Graham picked up his jacket. I trust that he has the same reasons I do to want this finished. He held the door of the storage unit. That's not the same thing as trust, but it's close enough for today. She walked out into the gray Chicago morning, and the cold hit her the way Chicago cold always hits, not gradually, but all at once. Etsy intervened, like the city had been waiting just outside the door, with the specific intention of reminding her that it didn't care who she was or what she'd built or what was being taken from her. She pulled the borrowed jacket tighter, and walked toward the truck. 60 hours. 2 dead men's documentation. A witness who didn't exist yet. And somewhere across town, in a federal building or a penthouse or both, Malcolm Reddick and Sterling Vane had almost certainly begun their Friday with the satisfied belief that the problem of Vivienne Carrington had been solved cleanly, quickly, and permanently, the way all their problems eventually were. They had never heard of Damien Holt, and they had forgotten, 9 years ago, to make sure Graham Rourke stayed forgotten. That was the thing about choosing to bury a case rather than close it. Closed cases stayed closed. Buried things had a way of working their way back to the surface, slowly and quietly, until one February night in a Chicago parking garage when everything that had been patient for nearly a decade finally ran out of patience, all at once. Graham started the truck. They drove toward Chinatown. The warehouse was on a side street off Wentworth, tucked between a restaurant supply company and a building that had been a laundry for 30 years, and showed it. Signage. Roll-up door on the street side, a standard entry door set into the brick on the south face, painted the same color as the wall, so you'd miss it if you weren't looking. Graham had been looking. He parked half a block away, and they walked in separately his suggestion, and Vivienne had stopped arguing about the operational logic of his suggestions, somewhere around Pilsen. She went first, crossing the street at the corner, hands in the jacket pockets, cap down. He followed 40 seconds later, taking the longer route around a delivery van that gave him a view of the block in both directions. Nothing moved with purpose. Nobody sitting too long in a parked car. He's standing in a doorway on a cold morning, without a reason to be standing in a doorway on a cold morning. He knocked twice on the south door, paused, knocked once more. The door opened immediately, which meant Holt had been standing on the other side sating, which meant Holt had been watching come down. The block on a camera. Graham hadn't spotted, which was fine. It was the kind of thing Holt would do. The man himself looked more or less like Graham remembered, with the specific modifications that 5 years and a private salary made to a person. He was 41 now, lean in the way. Distance runners are lean, with close-cropped hair going gray at the temples, and the kind of face that didn't give you much to read unless he decided to let you read something. He was wearing a plain, dark sweater and carrying a tablet, and he looked at Vivienne Carrington the way he looked at everything, with the systematic evaluation of someone assessing a variable. "Miss Carrington," he said. "Mr. Holt." She matched his register without effort, which Graham noticed and appreciated. The inside of the warehouse was about what the outside suggested: concrete floors, high ceilings, institutional fluorescent lighting. No. But Holtz had set up a working space in the far corner, 3 folding tables pushed together, 4 monitors, a router array that looked like it cost more than Graham's truck, and 2 camp chairs that had clearly been purchased for comfort rather than portability, which told that Holt had been using this space for long periods of time. There was also a third chair, set out already. Holt had been expecting both of them. "You've been watching this for 3 weeks, Graham said, as they sat. A question. Longer. Holt pulled up something on the center monitor. "I've been watching pieces of it for about 14 months. I didn't know what I was watching until 3 weeks ago, when your auditor's car went into the I-90 barrier." He glanced at Vivienne. "Marlowe. I'd come across his name in some financial forensics work I was doing for a private client. When he died the way he died, I started pulling threads. You told me on the phone you'd been watching The Wire," Graham said. Her accounts and a lot of other things." Holt turned to the second monitor. "If they froze the accounts through a federal financial hold, which required a federal authorization signature to execute that quickly. Emergency protocols. Whoever signed that had the authority to move within hours of filing, which means the filing wasn't made by an investigator working a fresh case. This was a prepared filing. Documents already drafted, argument already constructed, waiting for the trigger. They were ready for her," Graham said. "They were ready before she ran last night," Holt said. "I'd estimate the filing was assembled over the past 2 weeks. They've been watching her get closer to Marlowe's documentation, and they prepared the counter-move in advance." He looked at her. "You're not being investigated. You're being framed with the same evidence you were using to expose them, which is, I want to be honest with you, an impressive piece of work. Legally very hard to fight in a short window." "Monday," Vivienne said. Board session. Yes. Holt put his hands flat on the table. Here's what happens Monday if we don't change the situation. Sterling Vane calls the emergency session, presents the federal investigation as evidence of Vivienne's unfitness to serve, and the board votes to remove her as CEO pending resolution of the legal matter. Under the company charter, that removal gives the board chair Vane interim executive authority. He gets control of the company, she said. He gets control of $12 billion in assets under management, 47 active investment positions, and 3 pending acquisitions, one of which involves a federal infrastructure contract. Holt paused. From his position, he can then direct company legal resources against you personally, accelerate the federal framing, and make this situation sufficiently complicated that even if the truth eventually surfaces, by the time it does, the company has been restructured in ways that are very difficult to reverse. Warehouse was quiet for a moment. The monitors hummed. Monday is the real deadline, Graham said. Not some legal process. Vane needs control of that boardroom. Yes. Then we need to get ahead of it by Sunday night at the latest. Yes. Holt reached under the table and brought up a hard drive, which he connected to the center monitor. Which is why I want to show you what I found this week. Because some of it changes the shape of the problem. What came up on the monitor was a series of federal records, the kind that lived in database systems, that were technically secure and practically less so in the hands of someone who knew where to look and how to look without being seen looking. Holt walked them through it steadily, without dramatic emphasis, the way a man explains things when the thing itself is dramatic enough. The credentials first. Graham's DoD-attached task force identifier, dormant since he'd left his, had been accessed from inside a federal systems terminal 11 months ago. Reactivated in any way that would have triggered an automated notification, just queried, reviewed, and linked in a background process to 3 contract authorization records from the previous 2 years. On paper, if you were following a forensic trail, it looked like Graham Rourke had logged into a contractor database from a credentialed federal terminal and signed off on procurement approvals worth a combined $68 million. I've never been near a federal terminal in 5 years, Graham said. The access logs show a physical terminal in a federal building in D.C. You were in Chicago. I've pulled your repair shop receipts and a utilities bill from the same dates you were billing hours at the shop on 2 of the 3 dates, and the 3rd you were at a school event. Holt pulled up the next screen. They used a credential spoofing technique that required inside access to the federal system to execute. This wasn't an outside hack. Someone inside the building ran this. Someone inside Reddick's office, Vivienne said. Almost certainly. Holt navigated to another file. The second thing, which is the one I almost didn't find. He pulled up what looked like a vital records. Query a state-level database record from Illinois, the kind that got filed and rarely looked at again. A death certificate, issued 9 years and 3 months ago for a man named Jonas Creed, listed cause of death as accidental drowning, Lake County. Graham went still. Jonas Creed, he said. Holt looked at him. That name. He was a witness in the original Harrow investigation. Graham said it slowly, processing as he spoke. He was a mid-level contract administrator at one of the primary fraud companies. He had first-hand knowledge of the authorization chain, not just the financial records, but the actual communication structure. Who was giving orders to whom? He paused. He disappeared about 2 months before I handed the case to Reddick. You assumed Harrow got to him, Holt said. We assumed he was dead. Graham looked at the death certificate on the screen. And apparently so did everyone else. Here's what I found, Holt said. He pulled up a second record, alongside the death certificate, a property tax filing, Lake County, current year. A parcel in a small unincorporated township near the Wisconsin border, filed under a trust name that was 3 steps removed from any individual identifier. The trust was established 9 years and 2 months ago, 1 month before the death certificate. Vivienne leaned forward. He faked his own death. Someone helped him fake his death, Holt said. The certificate is real, filed by a real coroner's office, signed by a real official. The coroner retired 8 months later, which may or may not be relevant. He turned to Graham. I think Harrow threatened him, and he ran. I think he had help from someone who understood the system well enough to make a dead man stay dead for 9 years. Marlowe, Graham said. Holt nodded once. That's my working theory. Marlowe's secondary source wasn't someone who gave him documents and disappeared. Marlowe's secondary source was someone Marlowe had been protecting for nearly a decade. Someone who was waiting until he had enough to make coming back worth the risk. The room sat with that for a moment. Outside, Chinatown continued its Friday. The muffled sounds of the neighborhood traffic, a distant horn, the particular compressed noise of City K going about its business pressed through the warehouse walls and made the space inside feel more isolated than it was. He's still alive, Vivienne said quietly. The property taxes are current, Holt said. Paid annually through the trust. Someone's maintaining that property. He looked at Graham. And I think, given what's happened this week, Marlowe's documentation becoming public risk, your involvement now visible to Harrow.
Yeah.
I think Jonas Creed might be waiting to hear from someone. He won't know me, Graham said. I was never a public face of the task force. He wouldn't know my name, but he'd know Marlowe's name. And if we can reach him and tell him Marlowe left documentation that what Marlowe built is real and in hand, he might decide that 9 years is long enough to wait. Graham looked at the property record on the screen. A township near the Wisconsin border, a man who had watched the same corruption that had buried his testimony also bury 2 more people in the past month. How solid is this location? He asked. Solid enough that I wouldn't have put it on the screen if it wasn't, Holt said. He pulled a folded paper from his pocket and set it on the table. I printed it. Safer than carrying it digitally. He looked at Graham steadily. You'd need to go today. If we're working a Sunday night deadline, you need him in hand by tomorrow morning at the latest. That's a 4-hour drive, Graham said. About that. Maybe 3.5. Holt paused. There's something else I need to tell you before you go. The way he said it was specific enough that both Graham and Vivienne went very still. Holt turned to the third monitor. He brought up a communications intercept partial, fragments of a text exchange, recovered through means that he didn't explain and they didn't ask about. The exchange was from early that morning. 2 parties. One identified only by a number, the other identified by a name, not a full name, just a surname, typed out in the way people type things when they're in a hurry and not thinking about who might see it later. Rourke, confirm acquired? The response, negative. He moved her. Working on location. She's secondary. Rourke is the problem. He surfaces this and the credential play unravels. Understood. Adjust priority. Graham read it twice. They've shifted the target, he said. Yes, Holt said. Last night you were incidental a mechanic who got in the way and who they expected would back off once they regrouped. This morning, after you moved her and disappeared with her, you became the primary problem. He said it without apology, because apology would have been useless. Your background now. They know that if you're engaged, you don't just disappear, that if you surface the credential fraud, their entire manufactured case against her collapses. So they need to find me before I find Jonas Creed, Graham said. And before you give any of this to anyone who can act on it. Yes. Vivienne was looking at Graham with an expression he was learning to read, not fear exactly. He said, not first exactly, more like someone checking the structural integrity of a thing they're about to put weight on, making sure it would hold. You said last night that your daughter staying out of this wasn't negotiable, she said quietly. She's with my neighbor. He said it steadily. She doesn't know where I am. She can't be used as leverage unless someone physically. He stopped, picked up the prepaid phone, dialed Helen. It rang 3 times. Graham, is Katie there? She just went to the store with me. We're at the Jewel on Archer. Is something wrong? Do me a favor after the store. Take her to your sister's place in Oak Park. Go back to the house tonight. A pause. Helen had lived next to Graham for 5 years and had never asked him questions he clearly didn't want to answer. She wasn't starting now. All right, tell her I'll explain everything by Sunday. I'll tell her. Another pause. Graham, be careful. He hung up. Vivienne watched him put the phone down. She didn't say anything. She understood what that call had cost him, not the logistics of it, but the specific weight of being a parent who has to move a child around like a piece on a board to keep her safe, who has to call and say go somewhere else and trust that the words I'll explain by Sunday are going to hold. Okay, Graham said, drive to Lake County. You're coming with me. She blinked. I thought you'd want me here with Holt. Holt works better alone. Graham said, glancing at Holt, who nodded once in confirmation. And you're safer out of the city. If they're looking for me in Chicago, the last place they'll check is a county road near the Wisconsin border. He stood up. Also, if Jonas Creed is as frightened as he thinks he is, having the woman whose company is at the center of this seeing her in person, seeing that she's real and that this is real, might be the difference between him talking and him closing a door in our faces. Vivienne considered that for a moment, then stood. What do you need from me before we leave? Nothing, Graham said. Actually, tell me one thing. What? The board members who aren't vain. How many of them do you trust? She thought about it carefully, which he appreciated. She didn't give him the automatic reassurance of all of them or the defensive deflection of it's complicated. She actually sat with the question. 3, she said finally. Margaret Osei, she's been on the board 8 years, and she's one of the most ethically consistent people I've ever worked with. Raymond Chu, he pushed back on 2 acquisitions that Vane was pushing for, which tells me his judgment runs independent. And Patricia Nwachukwu, who I brought onto the board myself 2 years ago specifically because I wanted someone who didn't have existing loyalties to the old structure. Are they reachable? My phone is presumably monitored. Holt held up a second prepaid phone, still packaged, identical to the one Graham had bought. Use this, different number, different SIM. Make the calls brief, and don't explain more than they need to know. He set it on the table. Tell them to be at the Monday session, regardless of what they're told beforehand. Tell them there's information coming that will change the vote. And if Vane tries to get them to pre-commit, she asked. Tell them to wait, Graham said. Just that. Tell them you need them to wait. She picked up the phone. All right. Holt walked them back to the south door. He stopped Graham with a hand on his arm brief, the kind of contact that carries meaning without making a production of it. The intercept this morning, Holt said quietly. The one where they shifted priority to you. He paused. The number on the other end, the one giving the order. I've been running it for the last hour. Graham waited. It's registered to a shell, which is what I expected. But the shell has a billing address that traces through 2 more layers to a property management company in D. C, he said the next part carefully. The company manages properties for a holding group with a single named officer. Someone at Sun I don't think you'll recognize. But the holding group has a historical connection to a federal account number that appears in Marlowe's documentation. The architect, Graham said. I think so. I can't confirm. Whoever is above Reddick and Vane, whoever built this 9 years ago and has been running it since they're the one who ordered the priority shift this morning. Holt looked at him steadily, which means they know you're a problem, not from a distance. Specifically, Graham absorbed that. Can you tie the account to a name by Sunday? He asked. I'm going to try. Holt's voice was flat and certain. That's what I'll be doing while you're in Lake County. Graham nodded. He pushed the door open, and the cold came in. He turned back once. Damien, be careful with how you access that information. Holt almost smiled. Not quite, but almost. You're telling me to be careful. I'm telling both of us. He went out. Vivienne was already at the corner, waiting, her hands in her jacket pockets, and her face toward the street with the alert, contained expression of a woman who had spent a sleepless night in a stranger's house, lost her company's financial accounts before 8 in the morning, and was about to drive 3 hours into rural Illinois to find a man who had been legally dead for 9 years and who was, somehow, still standing. Fell in beside her, and they walked back to the truck without speaking, because there wasn't anything to say that the walking didn't already say better. He drove them out of Chinatown and north to the expressway, and then northwest, out of the city, through the suburbs and then past them, into the flatland that Illinois becomes when Chicago finally lets go of it. The sky was low and gray in the particular way of late winter Midwest, sky not threatening rain or snow, just present, the color of something that has decided not to commit. Vivienne called Margaret Osei first. The call lasted 4 minutes. No, Graham heard one side of it, Vivienne's voice steady, choosing words with the precision of someone who understood exactly how much information was right and how much was too much. I need you at the Monday session regardless of anything you hear between now and then. That's a significant ask. I know what the news is saying. A pause while the other person spoke. Then, I'm not going to ask you to believe me over what you're reading. I'm going to ask you to wait until Monday before you decide what to believe. Another pause. Then, and this was the part that cost her something, Graham could hear it. Thank you, Margaret. I mean that. Raymond Chu was briefer. He'd clearly been expecting the call, or something like it, which said something good about him. Patricia Nwachukwu was the most difficult. She was cautious, and cautious was right, and Vivienne didn't rush her, just made the ask and let it sit. When she hung up after the third call, she set the phone on her knee and looked out the window for a long time. They all said they'd wait, she said. Good. Margaret asked me if I was safe. She said it like the question had surprised her. I don't think anyone has asked me that in a long time. Graham kept his eyes on the road. What did you tell her? I told her I was working on it. She paused. Which is true. They drove. The suburbs thinned and then ended, and the flat agricultural land opened up, on both sides winter bare fields, the occasional cluster of trees along a property line, a water tower in the middle distance with a town name on it that neither of them would remember. The kind of landscape that made you feel both very small and very clear about things, because there was nothing to look at except what was already in your head. Tell me about Jonas Creed, she said. What you remember. Graham thought about it. He was 36 when I interviewed him. Mid-level, like Holt said, he wasn't in the boardrooms. He was in the administrative layer. The people who actually process the paperwork, the approvals, the sign-offs. The layer that makes everything look legitimate. The layer that knows exactly how the machine works, Vivienne said. Yes, he understood the entire authorization structure, because he'd built the paperwork for it. The scheme itself, he didn't design the fraud. He was the person who made the documentation clean. He paused. When I interviewed him, he was scared, but he was also angry. There's a kind of anger, you see, in people who spent years doing something they half knew was wrong before they let themselves know it fully. It has a specific quality. Guilt converted into purpose, she said. Something like that. He thought for a moment. He had a daughter, 12 years old at the time. He talked about her the way people talk about the thing they'd do anything to protect. Apparently threatened her. That's why he ran. Vivienne was quiet for a while. His daughter would be 21 now, she said. Old enough to not need protecting the same way. Old enough that maybe the calculus changes, Graham said. Maybe you spend 9 years watching a kid grow up under a fake name in a house that doesn't belong to your real life, and you start doing the math on what you owe her versus what you owe the life you had before. She turned to look at him. You understand that? He didn't answer immediately. The road ran straight and flat ahead of them, bare fields on both sides, the gray sky pressing down. My daughter was 11 when I came home, he said. I'd been gone most of the previous 3 years. When I walked in, she was polite. She made room for me. She didn't know what to do with me, and I didn't know what to do with the fact that she didn't know. He paused. It took about a year before she stopped treating me like a visitor and started treating me like a father. Another year before, I stopped feeling like I was playing catch-up to something I should already know how to do. But you stayed. I stayed. He said it simply, without credit in his voice, because he didn't think staying was credit. It was just what you did when the thing that mattered was in front of you, and you finally let yourself understand that. Jonas Creed ran instead of staying. I'm not going to judge him for it. Harrow threatened his kid. I don't know what I'd have done. You'd have stayed, Vivienne said. Not flattering him, just reading him the way she read everything. Maybe, he said. Or maybe I'd have run and told myself it was the smarter protection. He looked out at the flat land. The honest answer is I don't know. And the dishonest answer is that I do. She seemed to understand the difference. They found the township 2 hours and 40 minutes later for a cluster of roads on the county map that didn't add up to anything most people would call a town. A grain elevator, a volunteer fire station, a gas station with 2 pumps and a hand-painted sign. And beyond that, the county road that Holt's printout showed leading to the parcel held in trust. The house at the end of it was a farmhouse, white clapboard, old enough to have settled into the landscape. A truck in the gravel drive, newer than the house. A barn that had been re-roofed recently. A satellite dish on the south face that was the most current thing about the property. Graham stopped the truck at the bottom of the gravel drive. He didn't pull in immediately. He sat for a moment, looking at the house, at the lit window on the ground floor, at the thin line of smoke from the chimney that said someone was home and had been home for a while. He's in there, Vivienne said, probably. He might not answer the door. Probably won't at first. Graham opened his door. Let me go first. If he recognizes the task force context, that's the way in. If he doesn't, if 9 years in hiding has made him close down completely, then you come up and we try the other angle. What other angle? Tell him about Marlowe, Graham said. Tell him what Marlowe built, and what Marlowe didn't live to finish. And tell him what happens to your company on Monday if he decides 9 years of safety is worth more than what he knows. She looked at him. That's a hard thing to say to someone. Yes, Graham said, it is. He got out of the truck and walked up the gravel drive. The cold had gotten into the late afternoon at this latitude, sharpening itself against the flat land with nothing to slow it down. His boots on the gravel were the only sound. He got to the front porch steps and stopped. Nothing, for a long moment. Then a sound behind the door, not footsteps, just the particular quality of silence that changes when someone on the other side of a door is listening. Graham spoke toward the door evenly, without raising his voice. My name is Graham Rourke. I was attached to the federal task force that investigated Harrow 9 years ago. Elliot Marlowe left documentation. I have it, and I need 41 hours of your time. The silence on the other side of the door stretched out for a very long time. Slowly, the deadbolt turned. The man who opened the door was not the man Graham had interviewed 9 years ago. That man had been 36, solid through the shoulders, with the slightly harried look of someone who processed too much paperwork in too small an office and knew on some level that the paperwork was wrong. He'd had dark hair and a habit of pressing his knuckles against the desk when he talked, like he needed to feel something solid under his hands. This man was 45. The hair was mostly gray now. He'd lost weight in the way that long-term stress takes weight from people, not the clean loss of someone who'd been exercising and eating right, but the gradual erosion of someone who had been vigilant for 9 years without a break. His eyes were the same, though. That Graham recognized. Dark and careful, taking in information and filing it before giving anything back. He looked at Graham for a long time without speaking. Then he looked past Graham, at the truck, parked at the bottom of the drive, at the woman sitting in the passenger seat. Who is she? He said. His voice was lower than Graham remembered. Vivienne Carrington. She's the CEO of Carrington Capital. She's the one who found Marlowe's documentation. I know who Vivienne Carrington is, Jonas Creed said. She's all over the news this morning. Then you know what they're doing to her. Jonas looked at him for another long moment, then stepped back from the door. An invitation exactly. More like a decision he'd already made before the door opened, and this was just the physical expression of it. Graham turned and signaled to Vivienne. She got out of the truck and came up the drive, and Jonas watched her come the same way.
Yo.
He'd watched Graham with that quiet, systematic attention of a man who had learned that reading people correctly was not a professional skill but a survival one. Inside, the house was warm and spare. The furniture was functional without being uncomfortable. A couch, 2 chairs, a kitchen table visible through the doorway with 3 mismatched chairs around it. Bookshelves on the living room wall, full in the way that suggests someone who reads, because the alternative is to sit alone with their thoughts, which is worse. On the mantel, a single photograph. A young woman, maybe 20, laughing at something off camera. Dark hair like Jonas, his daughter. He saw Graham look at it. Jonas said, "She's at the University of Wisconsin. Pre-law." Something moved across his face, not quite pride, not quite pain, some combination that didn't have a clean name. She thinks my name is David Callum. She thinks I'm her uncle who took her in after her parents died in a car accident. The room was very quiet. She doesn't know, Vivienne said softly. She was 12 when I ran. I wasn't going to explain to a 12-year-old that the reason her life was being dismantled was because I'd spent 4 years signing off on fraudulent federal contracts, because I was afraid of what would happen if I stopped. He said it without flinching, which told Graham it was something he'd said to himself so many times it had worn smooth. I told her we had to go. She went. She was 12 and she trusted me and she went. He moved to one of the chairs and sat, not inviting them to sit, not telling them not to. They sat anyway. For 9 years, I've been her Uncle David. I've been watching her grow up and become someone I'm genuinely proud of, and she has no idea who I actually am or why any of it happened. Marlowe knew, Graham said. Marlowe helped me disappear, Jonas said. He was the one who found the coroner. Don't ask me how Elliot had ways of finding the right person for the right problem, and I never asked too many questions about the mechanics. He looked down at his hands, which were folded on his knee, and Graham noticed the knuckle-pressing habit was still there, just redirected his thumb, working against the base of his index finger. You knew, sir? When Elliot died, I knew. I was watching the news, and I saw the report about the overpass, and I knew immediately it wasn't ice. Elliot drove that stretch of road twice a week. He knew every curve. He left documentation, Graham said. For Ms. Carrington, 3 folders, financial records, communication intercepts, and his own conclusions. He protected your identity throughout no name, no direct references. Just a note that a secondary source existed. Jonas was very still. He named me a secondary source? He named you only as a secondary source. A thing that would identify you to anyone who didn't already know to look. Graham leaned forward slightly, but he was clear about what you represented. 41 hours of intercepted communications that he believed you held. Communications that connect Harrow to bribery, government corruption, and at least 2 murders. Jonas looked at him for a long time. I don't have 41 hours of recordings, he said. Graham waited. I have 63, Jonas said. Elliot undercounted. He only knew about the first set. I kept recording for another year after I disappeared, using remote access to systems I'd set up before I ran. By the time the access expired, I had 63 hours. He stood up and walked to the bookshelf. From behind a row of paperbacks on the second shelf, he pulled a portable hard drive, small, black, the size of a deck of cards. He held it without offering it. Reddick's voice is on here 47 times. Vane is on here 22 times. There are 3 other individuals I identified by cross-referencing the voices with public recordings. One of them is a federal judge in the 7th Circuit. One is a deputy administrator at the Office of Federal Procurement Policy. And one... He stopped. Who's the third? Vivienne asked. Jonas looked at her directly for the first time. The third one gives orders to Reddick, he said. Not the other way around. Reddick is senior in the official structure, but on these recordings, Reddick listens and confirms and carries out. He set the hard drive on the coffee table between them. I never found a name, but I found a phrase they use for him. They call him the founding member. Graham looked at Vivienne. Holt's word from that morning came back to him, the architect. Different word, same position. We think Holt might be close to identifying him, Graham said. Jonas repeated. He thought for a moment. Damien Holt, from the technical unit, yes. A complicated expression crossed Jonas's face. Elliot mentioned his name once. Said if things ever got bad enough, Holt was someone who might be worth finding. He looked at the hard drive. Are things bad enough? The woman sitting across from you is going to lose her company on Monday morning if we don't change the situation, Graham said. 2 people are dead. Your testimony and your recordings are the difference between this network continuing and this network ending. He said it simply, without urgency, in his voice, because urgency would have been the wrong note. Jonas Creed had been making decisions under pressure for 9 years. He didn't need pressure. He needed clarity. I'm not going to tell you it's safe. I can't promise you what happens to Emma's understanding of her life when this comes out. I can't promise you what you'll face legally for your own role in the contracts, though I believe Marlowe's documentation goes a long way toward establishing coercion. He paused. What I can tell you is that Elliot Marlowe is dead because he tried to finish this. And if you sit here with 63 hours of recordings and do nothing, whatever he died for dies with him. The fire in the wood stove ticked quietly. Outside, the late afternoon light was going gray and thin across the flat fields. Jonas looked at the photograph on the mantel. His daughter Emma, pre-law, laughing at something off camera. No idea that her uncle was her father, and her father was a man hiding from a corruption network in a house that didn't belong to his real name. She's going to find out either way, he said. Not to Graham or Vivienne. Just out loud. The way people say things they've been thinking for so long that they've finally worn through the barrier between thought and speech. If I go forward, she finds out in the middle of a federal case. If I don't go forward, and this ends if Harrow keeps going, eventually something else happens. Marlowe, another web. And she might find out then, or she might never find out, but I'll know. He turned back to them. I've been sitting here for 9 years, knowing. I'm tired of knowing and doing nothing with it. He picked up the hard drive and held it out to Graham. "Tell me what you need," he said. What they needed, as it turned out, required the rest of Saturday and most of Sunday to assemble. And none of it went cleanly, because things assembled under time pressure in the real world rarely do, regardless of how clearly you can see what needs to happen. They drove back to Chicago that night with Jonas in the back seat of the Chevy, the hard drive in Graham's inside jacket pocket, and the particular charged silence of three people who have committed to something that cannot be uncommitted. Jonas had packed a single bag efficiently in about 7 minutes, the packing of someone who had always kept a mental list of what he'd need if the moment came. Yes, he zeened. He'd stood in the doorway of his house for a moment before they left, back at the interior, at the books and the spare furniture and the life he'd constructed out of necessity rather than choice. Then he'd pulled the door shut and walked to the truck without looking back again. Graham had watched that in his rearview mirror and hadn't said anything. Holt met them at the warehouse in Chinatown at 11:30 that night. He'd been working for 12 straight hours, and it showed not in any dramatic way, because Holt didn't do dramatic, but in the specific quality of a man who has been staring at screens for too long and is running on something thinner than coffee, but more reliable than optimism. He looked at Jonas for a moment. "You're supposed to be dead," he said. Jonas said, "The recordings are real?" "They're real." "How many hours?" 63. Holt's expression shifted just slightly, just enough. He pulled out a chair. "Sit down. I need to verify file integrity before we go any further." While Holt worked connecting the drive, running verification protocols, pulling samples from the audio files and cross-referencing voice patterns against public recordings, in a process that took 2 hours, and involved software Graham didn't recognize and didn't ask about. Graham told them what he'd found on the name front. "The architect," he said. "Holt, what did you get?" Holt didn't look up from the screen. "I got a name at about 4 o'clock this afternoon. I've spent 6 hours since then trying to confirm it, because I don't put a name like this on the table without being sure." He typed something, pulled up a document. "His name is Arthur Brent. He's 71 years old. He was Deputy Secretary of Defense 18 years ago, left government service 14 years ago, officially to pursue private interests, which is the language people use when they leave for reasons that aren't publicly statable." He turned to the monitor. "His private interests have included board positions at 11 federal contracting companies over the past 14 years. 4 of those companies appear in Marlowe's documentation. 2 of them are in the top tier of the fraud structure. He built Harrow before he left government," Vivienne said. "Established the network, then stepped out so he could run it without oversight constraints." "That's my reading," Holt said. "He's not on any of the authorization records. His name appears nowhere in any federal database in connection with these contracts. He's been running this through Reddick as a cutout for the entire existence of the network." He paused. "He's also the one who gave the order this morning to shift priority to Graham." The warehouse was quiet, except for the soft sound of Holt's equipment running. "Brent," Graham said, turning the name over. He didn't recognize it from the task force work, which made sense 9 years ago. They'd been looking at Reddick as the senior figure, but he had been looking above Reddick. Reddick had made sure of that. "Can we tie him to the recordings?" "That's what I'm checking," Holt said. "Give me until morning." They worked through the night in shifts, Holt on the technical verification, Jonas walking Graham and Vivienne through the recordings in sequence, identifying speakers, explaining context, translating the bureaucratic shorthand of federal contract conversations into plain English. It was painstaking work, and it was exhausting. And by 3 in the morning, Vivienne had her head on her folded arms at the table and was asleep in the same position she'd slept in 2 nights ago at Graham's kitchen table, which struck him as the kind of detail that said something about a person's adaptability. Jonas watched her sleep for a moment, then looked at Graham. "She built that company herself," he said quietly. "I read about her, after I heard her name connected to Marlowe." "Yes, they picked her because her company had the subsidiary positions," Jonas said. "Harrow needed a legitimate corporate layer above the contractors to make the money flow look clean. Carrington Capital's subsidiaries provided that layer without her knowing." He paused. "She was being used without her knowledge for years, and now they're using her as the scapegoat because she got close enough to see it." That's the shape of it, yes. Jonas was quiet for a moment. I could have stopped this 4 years ago, he said. If I'd come forward when Emma turned 18. She was legal. She could have handled it. But I told myself it was still too dangerous. Told myself I needed more time. Needed more certainty. He looked at his hands. I think mostly I was just scared. You're not scared now, Graham asked. I'm terrified, Jonas said, with a flatness that was more honest than any amount of performed courage would have been. I'm terrified of what Emma is going to think of me. I'm terrified of what a federal prosecutor is going to do with my role in the original contracts. I'm terrified that we're going to walk into that boardroom tomorrow and it's not going to be enough. He paused. But being terrified of doing something and deciding not to do it anyway, that's a choice I've been making for 9 years. I'm done making it. Graham nodded once. By 6 a.m, Holt had confirmed Arthur Brent's voice in 11 separate recordings. The confirmation was technical voice biometric matching against public speeches Brent had given, cross-referenced against recordings from his government film service period, and it was solid enough that Holt used the definitive, which was not a word he used loosely. Brent appeared in the recordings, giving direct orders regarding the elimination of witnesses on 2 occasions. The language was careful, bureaucratic, the language of someone who had spent a career understanding that what you say and what you mean are safest when they live in different rooms. But the meaning was not ambiguous in context, and the context was provided by everything around it. He ordered Marlowe's death, Vivienne said, looking at the transcript Holt had pulled. She said it quietly, not with shock. She'd moved past shock sometime in the past 36 hours, but with the particular weight of anything confirmed rather than suspected. And Webb, Holt said, indirectly. He gives the instruction. Reddick executes the operational side. Can we use this in the boardroom? Graham asked. Holt looked at him. Define use. I need Vane to know that what we have is real and complete. I need the board to understand that the investigation against Vivienne is manufactured, that Reddick is compromised, and that the architect of the entire network is identifiable and on tape. He paused. I don't need to put the full 63 hours in the boardroom. I need enough that no reasonable person in that room can look at it and maintain doubt. Holt considered. I can pull a 40-minute package. Key excerpts, identified speakers, context documentation. To walk a boardroom through the structure of the fraud, the manufacturing of evidence against Vivienne, and the orders regarding Marlowe and Webb. He paused. It'll take me about 3 hours to assemble. Do it, Vivienne said. There's a problem, Holt said. There's always a problem, Graham said. The boardroom. Holt turned to Vivienne. Vane controls building security for the Monday session. He called it as an emergency session, which means he set the parameters. His private security firm is running access control, not the regular Carrington Capital security staff. I pulled the building permits for the session this morning. He brought it up on screen. Anyone arriving without prior authorization from Vane's office will be turned away at the lobby. Vivienne went still. He locked the building against me, against you and anyone accompanying you. Your keycard access has been suspended as of this morning's standard procedure with the financial hold, technically above board. He paused. Technically. I need to be in that boardroom, she said. I'm still legally the CEO. The board can't vote to remove me without giving me the opportunity to address them. Technically correct, Holt said. But if you can't get into the building, technical correctness doesn't help you much. Graham had been listening and looking at the building schematic. Holt had pulled up the Carrington Capital headquarters, a 32-story tower in the loop, glass and steel, the kind of building that had been designed to express the magnitude of the enterprise within it. He'd seen buildings like it before. He'd been inside a few that were less open than they looked. You did a security assessment, he said to building. He said to Vivienne. She frowned. 2 years ago. Standard corporate security review. We brought in an outside firm. She stopped. You were the outside firm. One of the outside firms. There were 3. We did the physical infrastructure assessment. He looked at the schematic. This building. I know how it breathes. Breathes, she repeated. Every building has unofficial paths, he said. Service access, maintenance routes, HVAC infrastructure. The routes that exist because the building needs to function, not because anyone invited you through them. He traced a line on the schematic with his finger. Carrington Capital occupies floors 20 through 32. The executive boardroom is on 31. The maintenance infrastructure for floors 28 through 32 runs through a service corridor on 27 that connects to the building's secondary elevator bank, the one used by facilities and cleaning crews. That elevator bank has a ground-level access point in the parking structure that is managed by the building's facilities contractor, not by whatever security firm Vane hired for Monday. You want to go in through the parking structure, Jonas said. I want to go in through the maintenance route that connects to the parking structure, up the service elevator to 27, and through the corridor to the fire stairs that open onto 31. Graham looked at Vivienne. You'd need to be dressed for it. Maintenance work order in hand. Camera coverage on the service corridor is a blind spot grid. There's a 12-foot gap near the junction of Corridor B and the stairwell access that we flagged in the assessment as needing a camera. It was still flagged as pending installation 8 months ago when I last checked the follow-up report. You think it's still pending, she said. I think Carrington Capital's facilities budget was cut 15% 2 years ago, and capital improvements are the first thing that gets deferred. He looked at her. Better than me. She thought about it. The camera upgrade project was moved to next fiscal year, she said slowly. I signed the deferral. Then there's a window. She looked at the schematic for a long moment. Vivienne Carrington, who ran a $12 billion company from a 31st floor boardroom, was now looking at a maintenance corridor map and calculating whether she could walk through it without being stopped. What do I need to wear? She asked. Sunday was a long day of logistics and preparation, and the specific exhaustion of people who have not slept enough, doing careful, consequential work. Holt assembled the audio package 42 minutes of Zerkted recordings, identified, documented, organized into a presentation that a boardroom full of people with no prior context could follow. Jonas went through it twice, confirming identifications, adding handwritten annotations in the margins of the transcript that only someone who'd been inside the network could provide. Graham made calls. 3 of them to people he hadn't spoken to in years, former task force colleagues who had moved into positions where, with some careful navigation, they could begin moving on federal warrants without going through Reddick's office. He was careful about what he said and to whom he said it. He gave enough to establish the seriousness of what was coming. He did not give names or specifics over the phone. He also called Katie. She answered on the first ring, which meant she'd been holding the phone. Hey, Bugs, it's Sunday. You said you'd explain by Sunday. Are you at Helen's sister's place? Yes. Mrs. Kowalski made me eat eggs again this morning. Despite everything, he almost smiled. She's looking out for you. She's feeding me eggs. Those are different things. A pause. Are you okay? He was standing outside the warehouse in the Chinatown alley, where the cold had settled into the afternoon with the blunt insistence of late February. He'd intervened. He thought about how to answer a 17-year-old who's smart enough to know when the truth was being managed and stubborn enough to push back on it. I'm in the middle of something, he said. Something I didn't start but couldn't walk away from. It's going to be finished by tomorrow. Finished how? The right way, hopefully. He paused. I need you to stay at Helen's sister's through tomorrow evening. Can you do that for me? I already am doing that for you. Her voice was not quite irritated, not quite scared. It was the voice of someone calibrating between the two. The woman you're helping, is she okay? He hadn't told her there was a woman. He thought about how she'd worked that out and decided it was just Katie being Katie, which was its own complete explanation. She's holding up, he said. Good.
A pause. Dad?
Come home tomorrow. That's the plan. He went back inside. By Sunday evening, they had what they needed, more or less. More or less was the honest assessment everything they'd assembled was real and substantive, and Graham believed enough. But enough and certain weren't the same thing, and Graham had been in enough situations where what should have been sufficient turned out to be insufficient to maintain any illusions about the difference. He said as much to Vivienne Sunday night when they were the last 2 awake in the warehouse. Holt was asleep on a camp cot he'd produced from somewhere. Joe Jonas was asleep in the second chair, his head tilted back, the hard drive on the table next to him, she said. She was looking at Holt's assembled presentation on the laptop screen. reading through it one more time. I've been in enough boardrooms to know that the best prepared argument doesn't always win. It's not going to be a normal boardroom situation, Graham said. Vane is going to try to shut it down before you can present anything. That too. She closed the laptop. I've been thinking about something you said. On the drive up to find Jonas, you said you understood what it was to come back to something after time away and not be sure of your footing. I said something like that. Do you feel sure of your footing now? He thought about it honestly. No, he said. But sure footing is overrated. You just need enough to take the next step. She was quiet for a moment. I made mistakes, she said. Before any of this, I built a culture at my company that was aggressive and fast-moving, and I told myself that was necessary. That was how you competed. And I was so focused on the forward motion that I created an environment where people who saw problems were afraid to surface them. Marlowe came to me with the anomalies, and I acted fast. I gave him the forensic team. I took it seriously. It took 6 weeks before I noticed the anomalies in the first place, and there are people inside the company who told me afterward that they'd seen something off in the subsidiary reports months earlier. Why didn't they come to you? Graham asked. Because I ran meetings at a pace that communicated implicitly that I didn't have time for things that weren't certain. If you weren't sure, you didn't bring it up. She looked at her hands. I didn't create that culture on purpose, but I created it. What are you going to do about it? If I get the company back, she said, I'm going to commission an independent review of the culture and release the findings publicly. Whatever they say, I'm going to restructure how concerns are surfaced. She paused. And I'm going to pay the employees whose work was affected by the subsidiary irregularities, even the ones who can't prove direct harm. That's going to cost you. Yes, she said it without resistance. It should cost me something. That's how accountability works. She looked at him. You paid something too. You left the investigation because you chose your daughter, and then you spent 9 years carrying the weight of what the investigation became because you left. I'm not carrying it anymore, he said. No, but you did. She studied him. You don't talk about your wife. No, you don't have to. Her name was Rachel, he said. It came out more easily than he expected. Without weight, it never came without weight, but without the specific resistance it usually carried. She was a teacher, 4th grade. She had a laugh that was too loud for indoors, which she was completely aware of and completely unwilling to do anything about. He paused. Died of an aneurysm. No warning, no prior symptoms. She was 33 years old, and she was fine on a Tuesday morning, and she was gone by Tuesday afternoon. Vivienne said nothing, which was the right response. Katie was 11, he said. I was embedded overseas when it happened. I got the call and flew back and walked into a house where an 11-year-old was staying with her aunt and had stopped talking very much. He was quiet for a moment. I stayed because she needed me, but also because I know how this sounds. I didn't know how to be the person I'd been before she was gone. The job I did, the missions, the context, none of it felt like something I could go back to and sustain. So I rebuilt around what was left. The repair shop, Vivienne said. The repair shop. The school pickup schedule. The parent-teacher conferences where I was always the only father, and half the time the teacher looked at me like they were trying to figure out where I'd come from. He almost smiled. Katie, mostly. Katie held the shape of everything. She sounds like someone I'd like to meet, Vivienne said. She'd have opinions about you, he said. Good opinions or bad? She'd have to decide. Katie doesn't preform opinions. He looked at her steadily. She'd respect that you built something real, and she'd want to know if you were honest about what it cost. I'm working on being honest about what it cost, Vivienne said. He stood up. Get some sleep. Tomorrow's going to require everything you have. She nodded. Then, before he could move away, Graham. He turned. Thank you, she said. Not for the protection. For treating this like it mattered. The whole thing, Marlowe, Jonas, the people Harrow buried. You could have told yourself it wasn't your problem anymore. It was always my problem, he said. I just took 9 years to come back to it. He found a patch of floor near the door and put his jacket under his head and went to sleep in the way that people sleep when they're not sure what the next day holds, but are sure they're going to need to be functional for it. Quickly, without ceremony, and not for long enough. The alarm on the prepaid phone went off at 5:30 Monday morning. Graham was up before it finished its first cycle. He stood in the center of the warehouse looking at the sleeping figures of Jonas Creed and Damien Holt, at Vivienne already stirring in her chair, at the hard drive on the table, and the laptop with its assembled presentation, and the 3 folders of Elliot Marlowe's meticulous handwriting that had started all of this 6 weeks ago, when a forensic auditor had found something in a subsidiary report that was wrong enough to risk his life over. The boardroom session was scheduled for 10 a.m. They had 4 hours and 15 minutes. He picked up the prepaid phone and called the first of his former task force contacts, a woman named Diane Chen, who now worked in the FBI's Financial Crimes Division in the Chicago field office, who had the previous day listened to 3 minutes of what Graham had told her and said quietly and carefully, "Get me something I can take to a judge who isn't connected to Reddick's network, and I'll have warrants by morning." She answered on the second ring. "Tell me you have it," she said. "We have it," Graham said. A short silence. "Send me the package. Digitally, we need the physical drive, and we need Holt's verification documentation. I'll have someone bring it to your office by 7. I'll be here." She paused. "Graham, if this is as complete as you're describing, Reddick will be arrested before noon," he said. "That's the point." He looked across the warehouse at Vivienne, who was standing now, running her hands through her hair, already in the process of becoming the person she needed to be for the next 6 hours. Not the frightened woman in a torn evening gown in a parking garage, not the exhausted CEO sleeping at a folding table, but the woman who had built a $12 billion company out of her own capability, and who was not, it turned out, finished. "Kay," she said, catching his eye across the space, "tell me what we're wearing to walk through a maintenance corridor." "I have coveralls in the back of the truck," he said. She looked at him. "Of course you do." He almost smiled. Outside, Chicago was beginning its Monday, the city assembling itself for another week of its relentless, indifferent forward motion. Somewhere in the Loop, in a 31st floor boardroom, with a view of the lake and the skyline, Sterling Vane was presumably beginning his own Monday with the confident expectation that by noon he would control $12 billion, and the problem of Vivienne Carrington would be permanently solved. He had never, in his career, been more wrong about anything. The coveralls were dark navy, the same kind Graham kept in his garage for work that got genuinely dirty. And they were close enough to what the building's facilities crew wore, that in a parking structure at 7:15. On a Monday morning, nobody looked twice. Holt had left an hour earlier with the hard drive and the verification package, heading to Diane Chen's office. Jonas went with him Graham's call, and Jonas hadn't argued. Having Jonas walk into the boardroom required timing, and the timing required that he not be anywhere near the building until the moment was right. Holt would bring him when Graham sent the signal. That left Graham and Vivienne moving through the lower level of the Carrington Capitol parking structure in coveralls and work boots, carrying a clipboard and a small toolbox, at a pace that communicated purpose without urgency. Vivienne had pulled her hair back tight and put on the plain-lensed glasses. She walked the way Graham had told her to walk, like she knew where she was going, and found it mildly tedious. Too fast. Not looking around. The walk of someone doing the 14th repetition of a routine they could do, half asleep. She was good at it. Better than he'd expected, though by now he was revising his expectations of her upward on a fairly regular basis. The facility's access door was where Graham's assessment had placed it, on the north wall of the lower parking level, behind a row of support columns. A standard keypad lock, the code for which was in the assessment report that Graham had written, and which, because facilities codes were almost never updated on schedule, he was betting was unchanged, was right. The door opened. The service corridor beyond it was institutional in the way that the unseen infrastructure of expensive buildings always is: concrete block walls, painted industrial gray, fluorescent lighting in wire cages, pipes and conduit running along the ceiling. The kind of space that exists entirely to make the spaces above it function, and which no one who works in the spaces above it ever thinks about. They took the service elevator to the 27th floor. The elevator was slow and smelled of cleaning products and something metallic. Neither of them spoke. The floor counter above the doors ticked upward with the patience of something that had made this trip thousands of times and had no opinion about it. 27 opened into a corridor that was essentially the mechanical backbone of the building's upper floors. Graham had memorized the route from the assessment schematic left at the junction, the HVAC units, right at the secondary electrical panel, to the fire door that opened onto the stairwell, serving 28 through 32. The camera gap was where the assessment had placed it, a 12-foot stretch near the B corridor junction, where the wall was bare and the ceiling mount was there, but the camera housing was empty, still waiting for the installation that had been deferred to the next fiscal year. Vivienne saw it and exhaled once quietly. Graham didn't say anything. He just moved through the gap at the same unhurried pace, and she followed. The fire stairs from 27 to 31 took 4 minutes. At the 31st floor landing, Graham stopped and looked at his watch. 8:52. The session was called for 10. Board members would be arriving now, filtering into the building through the main lobby, being processed by Vane's security setup. He looked at Vivienne. She had her hand on the door handle, and she was doing something he recognized: the specific internal reorganization of a person before they walk into the room that matters. Psyching herself up, not performing confidence, just getting herself level, getting everything that was extraneous out of the way so that what remained was exactly what she needed. He'd seen it in other contexts. Different rooms, different stakes. What you're going to say? He asked. I know what I'm going to say. She paused. I also know it might not be enough. It might not be, he agreed. He sat Keembirds. That's a comforting thing to tell someone before they walk into the most important meeting of their professional life. You don't need comfort right now, he said. You need to know what's real. What's real is that we have strong evidence, a credible witness, and 3 board members who agreed to wait. What's also real is that Vane has controlled that room for 11 years, and he's going to fight for it. He looked at her steadily. What tips it is you? Not the evidence is the foundation. What tips it is whether the people in that room look at you and believe you're telling the truth. Am I telling the truth? Every word of it. She nodded once. Then let's go. She opened the door. The 31st floor of Carrington Capital was its own world: marble floors, real art on the walls, the kind of space designed to communicate that the people who occupied it had earned the right to occupy it. The executive corridor ran toward the boardroom at the far end, and even at this hour, with the session not yet begun, there were people moving through it. An assistant with a coffee service, 2 men in suits Graham didn't recognize, heading toward the boardroom with the purposeful walk of people who had somewhere to be and knew it. They were not expecting Vivienne Carrington to be walking the other direction in navy coveralls. She stripped the coverall off in the corridor, fast. Underneath it, the clothes she'd changed into that morning: a dark blazer, charcoal pants, most professional combination available from the limited options Holt had sourced. A power suit by Vivienne's usual standards. But she wore it like one, and the way you wear something more than what it costs. She handed the coverall to Graham. He folded it over his arm like it was nothing. The assistant with the coffee service stopped and stared. Vivienne looked at her. Good morning, Angela. She said it, the way she said everything now, directly, without the extra layer that people put over things when they're uncertain. Is the board assembled? Angela, to her credit, recovered fast. Most of them. Mr. Vane's securities. I'm still the CEO of this company, Vivienne said, calmly. Until a board vote says otherwise, that remains the case. Thank you, Angela. She walked toward the boardroom. Graham fell in behind her, 2 steps back, the coverall still over his arm, which was an absurd detail in an absurd situation, and he was aware of that, and he kept his face neutral about it. The boardroom doors were closed. 2 men in dark clothing were standing in front of them, Vane's private security, the kind of professional fussle that looks like corporate until you look at it right, at which point it looks like something considerably less corporate. One of them put his hand up as Vivienne approached. Miss Carrington, this session is by authorization only. Mr. Vane's office, step aside, Vivienne said. Ma'am, I'm not able to. I am the chief executive officer of Carrington Capital, she said. And there was something in her voice that hadn't been there 4 days ago in a parking garage. Loudness, not aggression. Just an absolute, final, bedrock certainty about the truth of the sentence she was saying. This is my boardroom. I am going into it. You can step aside, or you can physically prevent me. And if you physically prevent me, you will want to have a very good lawyer available before noon. because what is happening in that room today is going to be a matter of federal record, and everyone involved is going to be on one side of it or the other. The two men looked at each other. Graham looked at the one nearest him with the particular quality of attention that communicated, without a word, that he had spent a significant portion of his life in rooms with people who were deciding whether to escalate, and that he had a clear view of how that decision was going to go. The nearest man stepped back. Vivienne pushed open the boardroom doors. The room was arranged around the long mahogany table that was probably the most expensive single object in a building full of expensive objects. 20 chairs, 16 of them occupied, 4 still empty. The windows behind the far end of the table gave a view of the lake and the winter sky, gray and flat and enormous. Sterling Vane was at the head of the table. He was 70 years old, silver-haired, in a suit that communicated institutional authority the way certain buildings do not through display, but through accumulated gravity. He'd intervened. He looked at Vivienne walking through the doors, and something moved through his face that he controlled very quickly. Surprise. Then calculation. Then the smooth, practiced expression of a man who had handled unexpected complications before. "Vivienne," he said, and his voice was warm and concerned and completely false, in the way that only becomes audible once you know. "I'm glad you're here. We've been worried about you. Please, sit down. There are some very serious." "I need 20 minutes, Sterling," she said. She walked to the far end of the table opposite him, deliberately, and stood. She did not sit. "Before any vote is called. 20 minutes to address the board." "The session has an agenda," Vane said.
"Given the circumstances, I don't think—"
20 minutes, she said again. She looked around the table at Margaret Osei, who met her eyes and gave the smallest nod. At Raymond Chu, whose expression was unreadable, but whose hands were flat on the table, not moving, which Graham had decided was this man's tell for paying attention. At Patricia Nwachukwu, who had said on the phone, "I'll wait," and who was visibly waiting. "I'm requesting 20 minutes to speak to my board. I am still the CEO of this company, and I am entitled to that." The room was very quiet. A board member Graham didn't know, older, white-haired, the look of someone who had been on enough boards to be instinctively cautious about anything that deviated from procedure, said, "Let her speak." It wasn't a groundswell. It was one voice. But in a room where most people were still deciding which way to lean, one voice at the right moment is enough to change the physics. Vane looked around the table. Graham watched him calculate. Denying her the floor now, in front of 16 witnesses, with her standing in the room, having clearly arrived under difficult circumstances, the optics were wrong. He needed the vote to look legitimate. He needed the process to look clean. 20 minutes, Vane said. He said it like a concession, like something he was giving her. He gestured to the empty chair at the far end of the table. She didn't take the chair. She stood and she began. She started with Elliot Marlowe, not with his death, with his work. She described what he'd found with the precision of someone who had spent 3 days living inside that documentation. And she described it without legal hedging, because legal hedging was for situations where you were uncertain, and she was not uncertain. She described the fraud structure, the contractor network, the ghost billing, the authorization chain. She described how the money moved and where it ended up. She put the $612 million figure in the room and she let it sit there. Then she talked about what had happened to Elliot Marlowe. She talked about Marcus Webb. She talked about what had been done to her, the manufactured case, the prepared filing, the frozen accounts, the leaked story. She said plainly that the evidence being used to investigate her was the same evidence she had gathered to expose the fraud, reversed and reframed. Vane interrupted twice. The first time she talked through the interruption without raising her voice, which was more effective than any amount of volume would have been. The second time, Raymond Chu said quietly, "Sterling, let her finish," and Vane stopped. When she got to the recordings, she connected her laptop to the room's display system. The connection cable was standard. It was her building, her boardroom, and she played 8 minutes of Holt's assembled package. Reddick's voice identified on screen. Vane's voice identified. The instructions passing down the chain. The specific exchange regarding Marlowe's elimination in language that was careful enough to be deniable in isolation and completely unambiguous in context. The room had been quiet before. Now it was a different kind of quiet. The kind that happens when people who have spent their careers in rooms full of information suddenly encounter information that is larger than the room. This EPS is fabricated, Vane said. His voice was still controlled, but something underneath it had shifted. These recordings are you can manufacture audio. Everyone knows that. This woman has been under federal investigation for financial crimes, and she's come in here with, I'd like to respond to that, said a voice from the doorway. Everyone turned. Graham had sent the text to Holt at the 9-minute mark, when Vivienne was laying out the evidence and the room's attention was fully committed. He sent 2 words, bring him. Jonas Creed stood in the doorway in a plain dark jacket, his gray hair, his careful eyes. He did not look like a ghost, though that was technically what he was, a man who had been legally dead for 9 years, standing in a corporate boardroom on a Monday morning in February. He looked like what he was, a tired, frightened, determined man who had been waiting too long to do a necessary thing and had finally decided that the waiting was over. My name is Jonas Creed, he said. Most of you won't recognize that name. The federal record says I died 9 years ago. I didn't die. I was hidden by a man named Elliot Marlowe because the people running the network you just heard on those recordings threatened to kill my daughter if I testified. He walked into the room. He didn't rush. I was the contract administrator who processed the authorization paperwork for 3 of the primary fraud companies in that network. I watched it built from the inside. I have 63 hours of recordings documenting every significant communication I was able to intercept over a 4-year period, including direct conversations between Malcolm Reddick, Sterling Vane, and the individual who constructed the entire network, a man named Arthur Brent. Vane stood up. It was a mistake, and Graham could see him realize it. The moment he did it, standing made him visible in a different way, exposed the agitation he'd been controlling, broke the appearance of the calm authority he'd been projecting. This man is a fraud, Vane said. He was investigated for his role in the very contracts. I was never convicted of anything, Jonas said, evenly. I was a witness who ran. I ran because I was threatened. I'm standing here now because Elliot Marlowe built the case that I was too frightened to build myself, and I'm not going to let his work die with him. He looked directly at Vane. I will testify under oath to everything I just said. Everything on those recordings is real. The federal agents who are currently executing warrants on Malcolm Reddick's office and on the 3 contracting companies identified in Marlowe's documentation would very much like to speak with you when this meeting is over. The room went absolutely still. Vane looked around the table. Graham watched him do it, the systematic scan of a man looking for support for the faces that would hold, who were still his. He found Margaret Osei looking at him with an expression that had nothing in it that was useful to him. He found Raymond Chu with his hands still flat on the table, watching. He found Patricia Nwachukwu, Wikino, who looked away when Vane's eyes reached her, not out of discomfort, out of the specific avoidance of someone who has already made up their mind and doesn't owe him anything. He found 16 faces, and not one of them was going to save him. The board member who had said, "Let her speak," the older man with the white hair cleared his throat. I moved to suspend the vote, pending review of the evidence presented today. All in favor? It wasn't unanimous. 3 members abstained, whether out of genuine uncertainty or residual loyalty to Vane or simple conflict paralysis. Graham couldn't tell, and it didn't matter. The suspension carried. Vane sat back down. He sat carefully, like someone managing a physical condition, and he put his hands on the table, and he looked at them. Graham watched his face go through something that didn't have a clean name, the specific expression of a man who has bet controlling outcomes, and who is, for the first time, sit inside one he didn't engineer. The boardroom doors opened again. Diane Chen came through them with 2 other federal agents, and behind her a man Graham recognized as an assistant U.S. attorney from the Northern District. Sterling Vane was handcuffed at the head of the table where he had intended to dismantle Vivienne Carrington's life. He didn't say anything as they put them on. He looked, in those last seconds before they walked him out, at Vivienne, and it was a complicated look, the look of someone who had genuinely believed he was building something, who had convinced himself over enough years that the network Convest has served was simply how things worked, who had perhaps lost the memory of the moment he had made the choice to become the person he was. Vivienne looked back at him without hatred, without satisfaction, with something closer to the expression of a person looking at wreckage and simply registering what it is. They took him out. The room breathed. After that, the next 6 hours were the logistics of consequence, federal agents, statements, evidence preservation, Holt arriving to walk Chen's team through the technical documentation, Jonas sitting in a room with the assistant U.S. attorney and beginning the process of saying, for the first time in 9 years, everything he knew. It was long and repetitive and procedurally exhausting. The machinery of justice doing what it does, which is grind slowly and thoroughly and without any of the dramatic efficiency of the moments that precede it. Arthur Brent was arrested at his home in Virginia at 11:47 that morning. Graham learned this from a text from Chen, 4 words, architect in custody, confirmed. He showed it to Vivienne, who read it twice, and then set the phone face down on the table and sat with it for a moment. Malcolm Reddick had been taken into custody at his federal office at 10:20, while Vivienne was still presenting to the board. No. He had apparently attempted to use his federal credentials to access a document destruction system in the 17 minutes between the moment Vane's private security team had alerted him to Vivienne's presence in the building and the moment federal agents walked in. The attempt had been blocked. Holt had flagged the credential system for monitoring 2 days earlier. Graham heard this detail and thought about 9 years of a case disappearing because he'd trusted a man with it and felt something settled that had been unsettled for a very long time. Satisfaction, exactly. More like the specific resolution of a tension you've carried so long you'd forgotten it was there, you only notice it when it finally releases. He was sitting in a conference room on the 29th floor when Katie called at 1:15 in the afternoon. He stepped into the hallway to answer. Dad, hey. It's on the news, she said. Carrington Capital. Federal arrests. They're not saying your name, but they're describing. There's a former military operative who, Dad. Is that you? Former SEAL, he said. And I'd prefer if the news wasn't describing me at all, but I don't control the news. A silence on her end. He could hear her processing, the specific quality of Katie's silences that he'd learned to read over 6 years of being her primary parent, the difference between the silence of confusion, the silence of worry, the silence of working something out. Are you okay? She asked finally. Yes, for real? For real. He leaned against the hallway wall. I'm sorry about this week. I'm sorry I couldn't tell you more. You don't have to apologize, she said, and she meant it, which made it worse. She'd learned not to require things from him when things were complicated, and he wasn't sure if that was resilience or accommodation, and it was the question he was going to have to sit with for a while. I'll be home tonight, he said. We'll get food from that Thai place you like. The one on 35th? Yes, Kay. A pause. Dad? The woman on the news. The CEO. She's the one you were helping. Yes. Did she do the thing they were saying she did? Good. He could hear something shifting in her voice, not relief. Something more complicated. I figured. You wouldn't help someone who actually did it. He'd intervened. He didn't say anything to that, because there wasn't a way to respond to your teenager having that level of basic faith in you that didn't feel like it would break something if you handled it wrong. No. Thai food tonight, he said. I'll be home by 7. Okay, Dad. He hung up and stood in the hallway for a moment, 31 floors above the listening to the building's particular silence, the hum of climate control, the distant sounds of movement on other floors, the institutional quiet of a place going about its work. Yes, he'd intervened. Then he went back inside. The months that followed were not a clean resolution, because clean resolutions are a thing that happens in the version of events that gets simplified in the retelling. In the actual version, things were complicated and slow and frequently frustrating, in the way that all real consequences are. The federal prosecution of Reddick, Vane, and Brent was expected to take 18 months to reach trial. The legal scaffolding was extensive: 3 primary defendants, dozens of co-conspirators, hundreds of witnesses, evidence that required specialized financial expertise to present clearly enough for a jury to follow. Graham gave his statement twice, once to the FBI and once to the U.S. Attorney's Office. Yes. Both sessions were long and required him to reconstruct events from 9 years ago in precise detail, which was its own particular exercise in the difference between what you remember and what you can prove. Reddick's attempt to destroy documents had, paradoxically, helped the prosecution. The attempt itself was documented and admissible, and it established consciousness of guilt in a way that no amount of careful lawyering was going to fully neutralize. Arthur Brent, who had built a network that had operated for 14 years and funneled $612 million out of federal accounts, hired the most expensive defense team in the country and announced his intention to fight every charge. His lawyers filed 12 pretrial motions. 8 were denied. The prosecution was not, by any measure, certain, but it was solid in the way that things built from 63 hours of recordings and a living witness tend to be solid. Jonas Creed cooperated fully with federal prosecutors. His own legal exposure for his role in the original contract processing was significant, and his attorneys negotiated a cooperation agreement that reduced his potential charges substantially in exchange for his testimony. He was not exonerated. He faced 2 years of supervised probation and a civil fine that represented a portion of the fraudulent approvals he'd processed. He paid it. He called Emma on a Thursday evening in April, from his living room in the farmhouse that was, finally, genuinely his. The trust had been dissolved, the property retitled to his real name, which was a bureaucratic process that took 6 weeks and cost him $400 in legal fees, and felt at the end like an act of returning to himself. He didn't tell Emma everything on that call. He told her enough that he was her father, not her uncle, that her name was Emma Creed, not Emma Callum, that there were things he'd done wrong a long time ago, and things he'd done to try to protect her that had not been the same as doing right by her. That he owed her an exospine that was too long for a phone call, and that he would come to Madison to give it to her in person if she would let him. She didn't speak for a very long time after he finished. Then she said, "I always knew something was wrong. When are you coming?" He drove to Madison on a Friday. He stayed the weekend. He told her everything. It was not a good weekend. It was not a healing weekend. It was a weekend of hard conversations and silences, and Emma sitting across from him at a table in her apartment with the expression of someone dismantling and rebuilding their understanding of their own life, which is not a process that happens in a weekend. But she let him stay. She asked questions, and he answered them, and when he drove back on Sunday evening, she didn't tell him not to come back. It was enough. For now, it was enough. Vivienne stepped down as CEO in April not because she was forced to, but because she made the decision herself as part of the independent review process she'd announced in February. She commissioned the review, received the findings, published them in full, and then told the board that she believed the restructuring process required leadership. That wasn't carrying the weight of the preceding events, and that she would return to the CEO role when the restructuring was complete. And the board was satisfied that the company's internal culture had genuinely changed. The independent review was not kind about what it found. It described a culture of performance over transparency, of speed over accountability, of implicit signals from leadership that uncertainty was weakness and weakness was unacceptable. It described in precise and unsparing language the exact environment that Vivienne had built, not deliberately, not maliciously, but with consequences that were nonetheless real. She released the report on a Tuesday morning. She held a press conference at which she read the key findings aloud, without hedging them, and then answered questions for 90 minutes. It was by any measure a difficult 90 minutes. She'd intervened. She fielded the questions the way she handled everything now directly, without the performance of certainty she didn't have, without pretending the answers were simpler than they were. She compensated employees who had been financially affected by the subsidiary irregularities. The compensation program cost the company $83 million. She authorized it before the lawyers finished arguing about whether it was strictly necessary. She was reinstated as CEO in October after the restructuring's first phase was certified complete. She walked back into the building through the front door, which, she noted to no one in particular, was significantly more convenient than the maintenance corridor. Graham went back to the repair shop. He had, in the weeks following the boardroom sessions, received 3 separate inquiries about returning to government work, one from the FBI, one from a DoD office, He declined to name even to Vivienne, one through an intermediary whose name he recognized as someone connected to the intelligence community in ways that didn't come with job titles. He declined all three. He agreed to consult on a limited basis on the Harrow prosecution technical questions about the task force period, confirmation of evidence from 9 years ago, testimony if required. He drew a clear boundary around that. Consultation, not reintegration. The distinction mattered to him. What mattered more was that Katie's first semester of senior year had started in September, and she was in the process of deciding where to apply to college, and she had opinions about this that required a parent who was present and available and not embedded in something classified. She wanted to study architecture. She'd wanted to for 2 years, but hadn't said so directly until September, when she put a folder of sample portfolios on the kitchen table one evening and said, with the careful casualness of someone who is trying not to want something too much in case it doesn't work out, I've been looking at programs. He looked through the folder. He asked questions. He listened to her talk about it in the way she talked about things she actually cared about, with a directness and specificity that reminded him, in a way that still had the capacity to catch him off guard, of Rachel. This is what you want, he said. Yeah, she said it quietly. Is that okay? Why would it not be okay? It's the schools are expensive, the good ones. Katie, he looked at her steadily. We'll make it work. She nodded, once, with the controlled expression of someone who doesn't want to cry and is managing it and knows that he can see she's managing it, which was fine, because she also knew he wasn't going to say anything about it. Okay, she said. He applied for a small business loan in October to cover the anticipated cost. Yes, he'd intervened. The loan officer at the community bank, a woman named Terry who had processed several loans for his shop over the years, asked him how business was going. Steady, he said. Trucks don't fix themselves. Smart to be in a recession-proof business, she said. He didn't tell her that the previous 3 months had included helping expose a 14-year federal corruption network and testifying before 2 federal agencies and walking through a maintenance corridor in a 32-story loop skyscraper in a Navy coverall. He said, yes, it is, and signed the forms. Vivienne called him on a Saturday in November about the prosecution, not about anything professional. She called the way she called when they've been circling something for a while and have decided to stop circling. Are you free this evening? She said. He was in the garage doing the 3rd oil change of the day. He had grease on both hands and a smear of it across his left forearm, and he was aware that he probably looked nothing like the person she was used to meeting in professional contexts. I could be, he said. There's a restaurant on the south side. Fancy it's the kind of place with paper placemats and too many tables and food that's actually worth eating. She paused. I thought we could have dinner like 2 people who aren't in the middle of an emergency. He considered that. That sounds like a significant change of pace, he said. I think we've earned it. He thought about the parking garage in February, the tracker in the clutch, the terrible coffee in the hotel break room, the storage unit in Pilsen and the farmhouse in Lake County, and the fire stairs on a Monday morning, and the way she'd walked into that boardroom in a Navy coverall and a borrowed blazer and told the truth until the room had no choice but to hear it. He thought he'd intervened. He thought about the way she'd photograph of Rachel and Katie on the mantle and hadn't said anything, which had been exactly right. He said, 7 okay? 7's good. He cleaned up. He told Katie where he was going, which produced a look of elaborate neutrality that communicated volumes, and he decided not to engage with it. He drove to the restaurant. It was exactly as she'd described it. Paper placemats, tables close together, the smell of something that had been cooking since the morning and had made good use of the time, and she was already there when he arrived, which he noted. She'd gotten there first and chosen a table in the back, away from the windows, which was a habit she'd apparently developed in the past 9 months that he recognized as his own influence and wasn't sure how he felt about it. She was in a sweater, no blazer, her hair down. She looked different without the professional armor, less just different. The version of herself that existed when the stakes weren't existential. He sat down. You look like someone who spent the afternoon under a vehicle, she said. I spent the afternoon under 3 vehicles. He picked up the menu, which had photographs of the food, which he'd always considered a mark of honest intent. How are you? Complicated, she said, which is better than terrified, so I'll take it. She looked at him. Katie applied to 3 schools? 5. She added 2 more last week without telling me, which I discovered when the application fee charges showed up. Vivienne smiled. I'd like to meet her sometime. She'd have opinions. You keep saying that. She keeps being opinionated. The food came rice and beans, and something, with short ribs that had been on the stove long enough to know what it was doing, and they ate the way people eat when they're not performing anything, which is the best way to eat. They talked about things that weren't the case. About Katie's architecture schools. About the book Vivienne had been trying to read for 4 months and kept putting down, not because it was bad, but because she never seemed to have 30 consecutive minutes. About the truck Graham was currently rebuilding. No, 1972 Chevy that a collector had brought in for a full restoration and which was the most interesting mechanical problem he'd had in months. About small things. Human-sized things. Outside, Chicago went about its November, the early dark, the cold, the city's particular mixture of beauty and difficulty that made people who lived there unable to leave. When they came out of the restaurant, she took his hand. She did it simply, without announcement. Without announcement. The way you do something when you've been thinking about it long enough that the thought has worn a groove, and the action is just the thing that fills it. Her hand was warm in the cold air, and he didn't pull away, and they stood on the sidewalk, for a moment adjusting to the cold. There's a question I've been wanting to ask you, she said. Okay, that night in the garage, when you stepped out from under the truck and asked how many people were following me. She looked at him. What would you have done if I'd said 8? He thought about it. Same thing, he said. She looked at him for a moment. Then she shook her head, and she laughed real laugh. Not the brief, startled sound from the early days, but something fuller, something that had room in it. The laugh of a woman who had been through something genuinely hard and had come out other side, not unscathed, but intact. They walked. The city was dark and cold and alive around them, and neither of them was in a hurry, and there was nowhere they needed to be except exactly where they were. Nobody was running. Nobody was chasing. The only footsteps were their own on the sidewalk, walking at the pace of 2 people who had both learned in different ways and at different costs that the ordinary things, a warm restaurant, a sidewalk at night, a hand in yours in the cold are not consolation prizes for the life you wanted. They are the life. They are the whole thing, and you have to survive enough to understand that before you can actually receive it. They walked into the evening together, and the city closed around them, and that was enough. That was, in the end, more than enough.